Okay, welcome everybody to Community History Online. I want to thank all our speakers that are coming in today, and particularly I'd like to thank Geraldine Aberbach, who is the driving force behind this project and is responsible for very many online history resources relating to our community. She's put together an excellent program for today. So please enjoy. Geraldine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gavin. It's lovely to be here, and it's really lovely to be with the Jewish Museum and the Kaplan Center and to talk about Jewish community history online. And we have a lovely group of speakers for us today. Professor Richard Mendelsohn will start off with Paro, then Gail with Vicky Sher will talk about Durbanville. Naomi Shamroth will talk about South African Jewish soldiers in World War II and their role in winning the war. Veronica will talk about her bibliography, and then we'll launch the latest community website, which is Malmesbury. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Richard Mendelsohn. I'm sure many of you know him. I recommend, if you like to do this, that you put your view in speaker view, and then you'll get the person who's talking without all the other little boxes. So in your top right-hand side, there is a thing that says view, and you can go down to speaker view. So Richard Mendelsohn, Professor Richard Mendelsohn, former head of the Department of Historical Studies at the University of Cape Town, Deputy Dean of its Faculty of Humanities. He's the author of Sammy Marks, a lovely book which I've read, The Uncrowned King of the Transvaal, and co-editor of Memories, Realities, and Dreams, Aspects of the South African Jewish Experience, and co-author with Milton Shane of The Jews in South Africa, and Illustrated History. So over to you, Professor Mendelsohn.
Thank you. Thanks, Geraldine. I'm going to be speaking today about a very small and not all that significant Jewish community, the Jewish community of Paro. In fact, so insignificant that the map of Durbanville has left it off the map, even though it's right alongside Bellville. The Paro Jewish community, in fact, dates from the early part of the 20th century. Paro itself emerged in the early part of the 20th century. Almost immediately, there are Jewish traders in Paro. Like other northern suburbs communities, it grows during the course of the 20th century. But again, like other northern suburbs of Cape Town Jewish community, it disappears by the last decades of the century. It builds itself a communal hall in 1927, which it uses as its cheder and as its shul and as its social center until 1951, when it builds a new synagogue. It builds a synagogue at a time when there's a wave of optimism in South African Jewry about the future. So other synagogues being built, but this synagogue by the 1980s is very depleted. The community is depleted. And in 1993, the shul itself is deconsecrated, but it has a second coming, a second life. And if you go to Ranana today in near Tel Aviv, you will see the Paro shul. The furniture of the shul, the pews, the bima, the pulpit were all moved from Paro and are now in Shiftei Israel in Ranana. Now, the project itself comes about because Paro has one unique distinction, and that is that it's the birthplace of one of the great family Jewish businesses of South Africa, of Cape Gate. In 1929, Isaac Kaplan, Solly Kushlik, three young men began making fences and subsequent gates and subsequent defenses, and created what is today Cape Gate, which remains, as I think most of you will know, a very great Jewish family business operating in South Africa and especially in Israel as well. Now, Cape Gate is coming up next year to its 95th anniversary, not its 100th anniversary, but its 95th anniversary, and the family members who presently run it have decided that they want some form of commemoration of the creation in Paro of Cape Gate. What they've chosen is to sponsor a communal history, a social history of the Jews of Paro. And we've put together, under the auspices of the Kaplan Center, a research team to do just this. I'm the head of the research team, and I'm also writing a history of the Paro-Jewish community, which will come out next year and will be hopefully richly illustrated. And the other outcomes of this project will be I think we're looking towards, and Gavin can confirm this, an exhibition at the South African Jewish Museum about the Jews of Paro, and also the creation online of a website which will house all of the resources for the history of Paro. We've put together quite a substantial research team to do this sort of project, and it might be of interest to be able to see this, to hear about the kinds of resources that we've accessed for this research project. One of the most important sources is oral history, and we've conducted interviews both locally and internationally through Zoom with something like 60 people who have a connection with Paro, including, I think, Rose Lera Cohen's with us today. She was a participant in the project, and we've interviewed many people about their experiences of growing up in Paro and also about their parents' lives in Paro. So that's going to be a very important part of the project, these interviews. In addition to that, we've also done a great deal of archival research. The Kaplan Center's archives at UCT hold the minute books of the Paro Hebrew congregation going back to the late 30s and through to the 1960s. And these are a wonderful resource for the history of the community, because unlike modern day minuting, where basically decisions only are recorded, these wonderful minutes record all of the debates that took place, often angry debates that took place within the congregation. And it's a wonderful opportunity to see all the foibles and all the disputes and all the difficult personalities, including the rabbi, who were members of the Paro Hebrew congregation. We've also done a lot of research in the state archives, the Cape Archives in Rowland Street, where we've had access to naturalization papers, estate papers, court cases. Jews of Paro are very litigious, so they're wonderful court cases around their businesses. And we've also there had the records of the local government, Village Management Board, which ran Paro for something like 40 years before it became a municipality. Again, a wonderful record, because the Jews, including my late grandfather, played an important part in the Village Management Board. Also, subsequently, there's the municipality, where Dr. Jack Karpus, who led Paro Jewry through the 1940s and subsequently played a very big role at the Hadassah Hospital. Jack Karpus was the mayor of Paro and a very prominent member of the Paro Jewish community. Now, a resource that I don't think has been sufficiently used for South African Jewish communal history is the Deeds Office. And the branch of the Deeds Office we used was the Deeds Office in Cape Town. And our researchers went through all of the registers of all transfers that took place in Paro over some 60 or 70 years. And we identified all of the property transfers involving Jewish individuals or Jewish companies. And we put them onto a spreadsheet of all of these property transactions. And what we believe this reveals is the importance of property as a source of investment for the Jews, not only of Paro, but of South Africa, but also property as a form of economic mobility. You moved upwards through investment in property, we would like to argue. Now, besides that, we also have visited the military archives, and that's of some relevance to a later paper today. We looked at the military archives near Silverton in Pretoria for those Jews from Paro who served in the Defence Forces. And we also looked at the Standard Bank archives at the Standard Bank's headquarters in Johannesburg, which gave a flavor, at least, of Paro economic life during the interwar years, and also gave us some rich nuggets about individual members of the congregation who were either good clients or not so good clients. The other resource, which I think has been widely used for research into communal histories, is the Jewish Press. And one of our researchers went through all of the South African Jewish Chronicles in particular for something like a 40-year period, looking for items about Paro. And you might think that that was a bit of a needle in a haystack exercise, given that Paro is not a particularly important Jewish community. In fact, the opposite applied, because for a lengthy period of time, the South African Jewish Chronicle was based in Cape Town and really published a great deal of parish pump news about Jewish communities, including that of Cape Town. So that gives you an idea of what we've been looking at. Our themes cover, the themes in the research cover a great range. The religiosity or otherwise of the community. It's a characteristically South African community of the mid-century, where it's an Orthodox community, obviously, but the practice of Orthodoxy is of the non-observant sort. Paro's real religion, its civil religion, is, and it's demonstrable, is Zionism. It's more important to the Jewry of Paro, or many of the Jews in Paro, than is religion. And of course, the other, and what Paro Jews, like the Jews of the northern suburbs and elsewhere, do on Shabbat, what they do is not go to shul, but they go instead to King David Country Club. King David Country Club is the real shul of Paro Jewry. So we looked at themes like Paro Jews at play, at recreation, Paro Jews at prayer, in shul, at Zionism, at the part that women play in a community which is heavily patriarchal. All of the shul correspondence refers to members and their wives. And in the list of the membership, there are only 4 women members. And those are elderly widows who've been members for a very long time. And in Paro, unlike the Cape Town Hebrew congregation, women are kept off the committee. They make an approach in the 1950s to the committee to allow women's representation on the committee, and they are snubbed by the patriarchs of Paro. So there are many interesting themes, including the relationship of the Jewry of Paro to the host community. Paro is an Afrikaans community. It's a very conservative community. It's an Afrikaner nationalist community, and the Jews of Paro are very conscious of this. They have very good relationships with all their Afrikaner neighbors, but at the same time, they're very careful to keep their heads below the parapet politically, whatever their views, personal views, might be of Paro. So that's the project in a nutshell, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that you might have about what we call the Paro project. Incidentally, we've created a Facebook site for those who might be interested in Paro, and I've been posting photographs that we've been collecting on that Facebook site.
Can you do it? Oh, yes, take the keys in the little drawer. Sorry.
So are there any questions?
Richard, that's absolutely amazing in that, you know, this is the real deal, as it were, you know, and it's a real example. I'm sure there must be people who want to ask you questions. So could you raise your virtual hand, or, you know, there are not so many people, just unmute yourself and jump in, and we'll see what we can do. Otherwise, Richard, we'll go on, and I can't see anybody who's wanting to ask a question. Can anybody? Rose Lera Cohen, would you like to unmute yourself and talk to us, Rose?
Hi, Richard, how are you? I just wanted to ask you about the point of the Holocaust. Isn't it worthwhile just mentioning that as well? Because it comes up in the Jewish Chronicle every now and then.
Yes, you and I have discussed this, Paro's attitude towards the Holocaust, and in the interview that I did with you and also with your brother, we had, particularly with you, an interesting discussion around the Holocaust, because at least in the late 1940s, particularly in the 1950s, the Holocaust, as you well know, Rose, is the great unspoken topic in South African Jewry. Yes, there are commemorations of the Holocaust. They begin with on the date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but for a large part of the para-Jewish community, at least, it's not something that's much spoken about. And of course, you spoke about the example of your dad, which I found quite fascinating. Somebody who came from Daheim and who lost close members of his family in the Holocaust, yet it did not talk much about it. And that seems to be true of other people I interviewed as well, whose parents had a family in the Holocaust. It was the great, as we know from other studies, the great unspoken subject. And yet in Parow, there were these direct connections. And one of the most interesting direct connections is through a German Jewish family called the Levies. It's a Litvak community, and Walter Levy is that very rare Yekka amongst the Litvaks in the Parow Jewish community, very prominent member of the community, and he has his sister back in the in Europe during the war. She escapes Germany before the war. She goes off to Belgium with her husband and with her young son, and tragically, she and her husband are rounded up and are murdered, and the son miraculously escapes. He's a boy called Hans Rothschild, and after the war, his uncle in Parow manages to track him down. 1946, he's brought out to Parow, brought out to Cape Town on a troop ship. He's been a child in hiding. He's been hidden by the Catholic Church for much of the war years, and he comes out to Parow in the mid-1940s and resumes a normal life. And he goes off, he learns English, and he goes to the local Parow school. And the wonderful part of the story is that he manages to qualify to go to university, becomes a doctor, and Hans lives in Johannesburg today. He's a retired 90-something-year-old doctor living in Johannesburg. So Hans is Parow's most direct connection with the Holocaust.
Well, that's very interesting, because Walter Levy married my mother's cousin, Molly.
Oh,
and
your cousin. Oh, well, I'm writing about Molly in the book. Molly Levy, a wonderfully vibrant sort of person, South African born, unlike her husband. She lives in Parow, and she's very much a leading women's figure in the Parow Jewish community. Very dynamic a person. And at the end of the 50s, Walter incidentally owns a business in Parow called National Bazaars, which is an association with Woolworths. So already in the late 1940s and 50s, National Bazaars is being run on Woolworths-like lines, and it stocks Woolworths products. And later in that decade, Walter Levy actually sells the business to Woolworths, becomes a full part of Woolworths, and he himself works for Woolworths, and one of his sons becomes, as you know, a director of Woolworths. And Walter does very well. He's a very important figure in Parow. He's, as I said, a Yekka amongst the Litvaks. And what that means is that his standards of behavior, his expectations of how you conduct yourself are very different from our rather more Hamish and more relaxed Jews of Parow. And in the minute books, this is the sort of thing that goes into the minute books. He's very concerned about decorum, the lack of decorum in the Parow shul, people getting up and walking out during services. And because he's a powerful figure, he manages to persuade the Parow Jewish community to at least appoint a subcommittee to look into this issue of decorum. I don't think it ever comes to anything, but that's Walter Levy, who, as you know, is married to Molly, and they eventually end up living in Bishop's Court in Cape Town.
I stayed in that house babysitting their children when I was at university. So that's a nice connection. Brahmi, you wanted to say something?
Thanks very much. And thanks, Richard, for covering a lot of territory in a small amount of time. Just a comment on a question. The comment was Parow seems to have some characteristics of the country communities, but also some of the urban, and a difference between Parow and the country communities is that on Saturday mornings in the country communities, all the people went to run their shops because it was the most important shopping day of the week. So they didn't go to shul either, but they didn't go to the country club. I wanted to share your comments about the minute books, because we have the minute books for Uppington also, and they're fascinating. there's a lot of innuendo in there, and who knows what was going on, because the people of the day knew what was going on. But you mentioned the rabbi being involved in some of the kerfuffle. And in the Uppington Minute books, one of the most frequent discussions was about firing the rabbi. There was always a motion to fire the rabbi, and I was curious if that was just the nature of the Uppington community, or if you see this in the Parow books as well.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's actually very useful to me, because we have exactly the same discussions in Parow. Let's fire the rabbi. It seems to be the litany, the regular sort of litany. And then I'm afraid, to some extent, the calls to fire the rabbi were half justified. The rabbi himself is a fascinating figure. There's a fellow called Benjamin Lipschitz. He comes out to Parow in 1930. And he survives in Parow till 1964. And he goes, despite all these calls for his firing, he goes under his own steam and retires in 1964. And he's a fascinating figure because he's yeshiva educated, comes from Poland initially. He's educated in yeshivas in Palestine, as it was in the 1920s. But he's fascinating too because he combines yeshiva education with secular education. He regularly attends lectures at the Hebrew University. He's fascinated with Hebrew literature. So he's unusual in that respect. He's a very staunch Zionist, to the extent that he marries the niece of the great Rav Kook, the great leader of religious Zionism in 20th century Judaism. So he marries into religious royalty. So he comes out to this godforsaken Parow in the 1930s. It's very strange. And he spends the rest of his life there. What is a very fine educator. On the one hand, he's a very fine educator with quite sophisticated ideas about education. But on the other hand, he's also the traditional Cheder teacher of the shtetl. What does that mean? He uses physical force to drive home his lessons. I remember, and I'm sure Rose does as well, him going around the classroom clapping us with his ruler. And this is South Africa in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And a rabbi clapping kids is no longer acceptable. So there are endless complaints in the minute that the rabbi is beating our children. And that leads to exactly what you were talking about in the Uppington case, which is lengthy discussions, committee meetings devoted to how best to fire the rabbi. But somehow or other, he manages to survive those attempts to push him out. They're wonderful. There are pages and pages minuted of these meetings where they go into all of his shortcomings. Walter Levy, the German Jew I spoke about, 1949, big attempt to push out the rabbi. He's all in favor of it. And he comes up with a list of 10 points of what's wrong with this rabbi. There's no decorum, there's no atmosphere in the shul, his sermons are lousy, etc., etc., etc. So I suspect, as you've indicated from the Uppington case, this is not an unusual feature of South African Jewish communal life, big and small. Next question.
Yeah, David Bess, unmute and talk to us.
Good afternoon, Geraldine and everybody else attending this forum. Thank you very much for giving me a moment. I do need to very quickly say a very special hello to some people and faces that I haven't seen for a very, very long time, and how delightful that is. One of the names on the list is Jaime Ehrlich, I think. And that brings me to a question on a more macro level for you, Richard. Right next door, a little bit south of Parow, is Goodwood. And of course, there was a very vibrant Jewish community in Goodwood, as there was in Parow, and synagogue. And I never lived there, but several of my relatives did live in Goodwood. And I'm hoping that the enthusiasm for recording the Jewish history of Parow will bleed over into Goodwood as well. And I'm sure Hani would agree with that. So is there any sense that the project may continue or go over the boundary into Goodwood as well?
I don't think this project will. Of course, there are three vibrant communities nearby. There's Goodwood to the west, there's Bellville to the east, and to the northeast there is Durbanville. There's a whole cluster of Jewish communities, all of which, of course, sadly have since disappeared. And there's also an interesting sort of relationship between them, because there's a great deal of cooperation, particularly at the level of Zionism, the B'nai Zion and other such organizations across these communal boundaries. There's also an interesting sort of competition between them. And I was just looking the other day at a sort of minute book entry, which talks about the early entry, speaks about the birth of the Goodwood community. Yes, we welcome the birth of it, but we notice they're trying to poach one of our members, and we're going to take this up with them. There's that sort of competition between these rival Jewish communities. The other thing that links all of these Jewish communities, and you mentioned earlier, another interesting thing is that one of the groupings, important groupings, as Gail has demonstrated in all these Jewish communities, is the professional grouping, particularly the medical grouping. So you have these Jewish doctors who dominate the northern suburbs in the 1940s and 50s and into the 1960s. And these doctors have very close links with each other. They're friends with each other, they cooperate with each other in a whole series of ways. And as you will know, Gail has assembled on the Kaplan Center site a wonderful exhibition, online web exhibition, about the Jewish doctors and pharmacists of Para, Goodwood, and of Belleville. It's well worth looking at. Are there any other questions?
Yes.
Charlotte, just a short question, and then we'll go on. I see that Harry Freeland's asked a question, but I think we'll have that later because it could be a long discussion and we need to move on to the next thing. So Charlotte.
Hi, Richard.
Hi,
I
Charlotte.
was just wondering if your Paro is going to include Shiftei Israel, your book, any information? Because, you know, Petersburg donated to Torah, Sifrei Torah, and they had a big ceremony. Yeah, and I have a lot of information about that ceremony if you're interested in any of it.
Yes, Charlotte and I spoke together at the Jewish Book Festival quite recently, and we had great fun comparing Petersburg and Para, which have very striking similarities in many respects. So, as you've mentioned, one of them is that Petersburg has also given rise to a synagogue in Israel, as has Para. So certainly Shiftei Yisrael in Ra'anana will feature in the book. And Para, incidentally, has a second synagogue in Israel, and that is called Oel Nechama. It's a beautiful synagogue connected with people who came from the Hebrew University, and that's in Jerusalem. And Oel Nechama was the result of a benefaction by that controversial rabbi that I spoke about. He was also involved in property investment in Paro like everybody else. And when he left Paro, he took with him the proceeds of his Paro investments. And one of the outcomes of that ultimately was his donation for the creation of Oel Nechama, named after his late wife in Jerusalem.
That's wonderful. So thank you for that. And we really look forward to the next stages in your research. It's in the website when it gets there. Now I'm really happy. Yeah.
Sorry, can I jump in quickly? For some reason, I'm not able to raise my hand, but I just wanted to make a tiny quick point.
Go on.
Just related to what David Bass said, hello David, which was about kind of expanding the study to other communities. And it strikes me, I mean, I'm coming to this both as a South African who's kind of enjoying the nostalgia and all of that, but also as a historian, and I'm very conscious of the funding or not that's available to do work on South African Jews. And it seems fairly clear to me, I don't know, Richard, you can answer this, but I think the reason why there's funding to do a project of this extent on Paro is because there's funding behind it. And I'm really struck by the extraordinary work that's been done, that is being done by an army of volunteers doing the most amazing work, excavating stuff about South African Jewish history. But for those of us who are in the world of professional history writing, that lack of funding is really direly felt. So just to kind of throw that out there.
Thanks, Shirley. I know how you feel.
Yeah, I think it's just to very quickly respond to that. Quite agree, Shirley. And Paro is in quite a unique position in the sense, I mean, you and I have worked for a very long time in the profession, and certainly in my own experience, I've never experienced quite this level of funding as for this project. So I feel remarkably privileged in this particular project.
well, I think one has to say that the Kaplan family have just been incredibly amazing as far as Jewish history of South Africa is concerned. You know, one only has to think about the walkway between Muizenberg and St. James, but you know, the whole Kaplan Center is there. So
Jewish Museum and the Jewish Museum.
and the Jewish Museum. So, you know, South Africa's been very blessed from Parow. So it's good that they're promoting Parow, so that you've got it. But you know, maybe there are other businesses in other towns that could be inquired from if they want to do something like that. Thank you very much, Richard. Wonderful to hear from you, and wish the project so much success, and look forward to seeing the next thing. So Gail, in a way, you are the younger brother or sister coming in talking about Durbanville. So Gail, as Richard has mentioned, has already done an exhibition on the doctors from the northern suburbs of Parow, Goodwood, everywhere. She's a doctor in Tel Aviv, and very interested and a wonderful inspiration for this community history online, and a pleasure to work with. And she's going to talk about Durbanville together with Vicky Scher. So Gail, can I ask you to take the stage?
Just before we start, we have a slight technical issue that maybe somebody here can patiently describe to Vicky, who's sitting in Jerusalem, and is extremely brave and courageous to be venturing and talking to us soon. But she doesn't know where to find the little microphone to unmute herself on her iPad. And I haven't got an iPad. I have no idea where it is on the screen right now. So there she is sitting. I can see her, and I've been trying to talk to her for a long time on the phone.
I found it.
Oh my goodness. Okay, fantastic.
But
Vicky,
thanks for your patience and
okay.
encouragement.
Well, you are a star, honestly, Vicky.
No, without you, I wouldn't be near the moon.
Well, you said we shouldn't have taken your blood pressure, right?
Right, of course not.
So, all right, we'll start off with Durbanville. Now, I'm going to go to the share screen. And as I do this, I'll start talking about Durbanville. Well, to be perfectly honest, I come from Bellville. It certainly had nothing to do with Durbanville in terms of the way I saw things and saw the city or the town itself. Far more related to Parow than I was to Durbanville, but there was something extremely charming always, and I'd say kind of magical about Durbanville. Maybe it was that road going up with the trees on either side, and it was the vines and the agricultural aspect of the town, but it was totally charming and lovely. And what happened was a couple of years ago, somehow Vicky and I, who comes from Durbanville, got talking. She lives in Jerusalem and I live in Tel Aviv. And we worked out that she'd written or has been having, she has the story of hers, a very personal story that she, you know, wanted to tell. And she has told it a number of times, but wasn't quite happy with how it came out. And so we got chatting and worked on her story of Durbanville. And what I just noticed about this Durbanville compared to our town of Bellville was the close sort of relations and connections between the various members of the town, the multi-generational feel there, that there were actually, you know, the grandparents or immigrants still from Lithuania who were living with their children and the grandchildren. We didn't have that in Bellville at all. There was a sort of a fabulous feeling of cohesiveness when you think about it, as she would talk to me. And then the rabbi, I think he was a reverend, he wasn't a rabbi, and that's always a very sensitive point, was very influential in teaching the children over their Hebrew, their bar mitzvahs. His name was Rabbi Dorogov. Okay. Dorogov, who eventually moved to Maitland, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway,
no, to Goodwood. He went to Goodwood.
Oh, to Goodwood. Okay. And so the people who came from Durbanville definitely adhered to and cherished their roots, their traditional roots. And they were great Zionists, many of them came to live in Israel. There were many very influential and prominent people of that Durbanville community. And so what I wanted to show you was that I actually made a memoir of what Vicky sort of wrote about. It starts off here in her personal memories. This is just on our site itself, on the community site. And it's all very, very intriguing and I think welcoming to read. Lots of pictures, family stories, etc. And the amazing thing about Vicky, and I'm sorry if I say your age, Vicky, but I've never met somebody of 90 years old who has such an amazing memory. Who remembers every single person who ever was in Durbanville. And so all these names at the bottom of this story, actually, I think I can't remember how many people there were. She remembered them and their children's names and heaven knows what. So we managed to sort of work this out. And I want to sort of stress that Vicky insists, and I think she's quite right, that this is her personal story. She's definitely invited anybody else who would like to contribute to Durbanville's story to do so. And I think that there's a big sort of chunk of this research that's missing, and that is we don't actually yet have a site about Durbanville. We have Vicky's story as a memoir, but we don't have a site with the driver and you know, the various stories and the people actually on a site. And this brings me to another interesting point which we discovered together, and I hadn't known this, and maybe Richard can give a little bit more information, that Durbanville wasn't regarded as a country town. It was regarded as a town that was part of Cape Town, and it was in the northern suburbs, say, but it wasn't a country town, and it didn't have all the different kind of, I wouldn't call it rights, but the way of looking, the perspective of looking at Durbanville as do other country towns. And somebody mentioned, and it seems a little bit of a strange theory, but maybe it is true, that there wasn't a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery in Durbanville, that the Jews there were buried in Cape Town. Whether that was to do with it, or, you know, how it actually happened, I'm not sure, but it wasn't given the status of a country town. So I think that having said all these little things, I'd love to hear Vicky now tell you all about her experience and story. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you for having the patience to try and work out your Zoom.
Thank you, Gail.
Okay.
So can I start?
Yes.
Can I start?
Start.
I will probably be repeating a few things that Gail said in the introduction. Durbanville is on the northeast of Cape Town, and I was not born in Durbanville, and I did not grow up in Durbanville. I grew up in Cape Town, and that's where I lived until I met my darling husband, and we got married, and I went to live in Durbanville. But there was something about the country areas that had so much for me. When we went for a drive on a Sunday, we would go to Stellenbosch, to Paarl, to Wellington, and just seeing the peaceful quiet, the greenery, everything was so gorgeous. And my first visit to Durbanville was before I met my husband. His sister had invited us, me and my parents and my brother, to come for afternoon tea on a Sunday. And when we knocked on the door, my sister-in-law, she came to the door, and behind her were her parents with such a gracious, warm welcome. We'd never met the people. They didn't know us. We didn't know them. And the hospitality was just wow. So that was before I really came to live in Durbanville, but that's just a personal thing. Durbanville was a very, very small village. And when you drove out towards Durbanville to the left, when you left the northern suburbs and you went along this beautiful avenue of trees lined on both sides, and when you looked to the right, you could see the luscious green fields of wheat or whatever was growing there. It was small holdings and there were farms. And when you came to the end of that road and you went into the small village, you got such a feeling of, I don't know, understand. It was just a comfortable, warm feeling. And on the left was the big white church of the Dutch Reformed Church. And on below, on the right, on the left, that was on the left, and on the right was the Durbanville Town Hall and the library and the police station. Now, because it was a very small place, a very small village, and it was also very, very primitive. But I'll start at the beginning with the Sher family. The first one to come to South Africa from Plungyan in Lithuania was Nochem Sher, the oldest son of Joseph and Sorafreda Sher. He came, he was like the forerunner of the family. And after a few years, two of his brothers followed him, Philip and Chaim. And thereafter, in 1904, the man who became my father-in-law, Abi Sher, came at the tender age of 10 with his widowed mother to join his other brothers in Durbanville. And he went to school in Durbanville as a little boy. And he used to tell us a sweet story. He said to me, the Shkotzim lag always, the little Christian kids, they always used to chase me and torment me. And one day he said he jumped through the fence, a hole in the fence, and caught his sweater on the fence running to get to his mother. By the time he got home, there was no sweater left. All he was left with were the sleeves on his arms. The whole thing had unraveled. That's just a little aside to show that even then children, and also they probably used to tease him, and by the way he spoke, by the way he was dressed. But anyway, never mind, time moved on, and like everybody else, he made a success of his life. And in 1920, I think it was, he married his wife, Golda Berman, who was also from Plungyan. And they bought a house, a beautiful house, an Edwardian style house. And if anyone is interested, that house and another house which belonged to Uncle Chaim on 22 Oxford Street are on the internet if you want to see it, in the historical tour of Durbanville. Those two houses feature. And when they got married, they had the children, and it was in the early 20s, and by then they had two sons, Joe and Noki. And the people in the shul, there were other Jewish people by then as well, and they felt that there was a great need to build a shul, which was that they didn't have that. So Mr. Barak, who owned the land, piece of land, he gave the land for the shul. And in 1926, 27, the shul was opened. And people came from all over, from all the country districts, from Cape Town, the dignitaries, the chief rabbanim, all of them came. You'll see a photo at the end of the project, and all these people standing outside the shul. That was the day of the opening of the shul for the first time in Durbanville. At the time, they needed to have a spiritual leader. So they chose Reverend Dorogov, and he came to live in the village, but he was a bachelor. And needless to say, there were no homes or apartments that were available for rent and things like that. So he landed up living in the Sher's house in Queen Street, and he lived with them for 18 years when he met his wife, and he went to live in Goodwood. Now, in 1932, by 1932, the two daughters had arrived, and in 1932, the maternal grandparents came from Plungyan, and they also went to live in the house. So you can imagine what Galut Yisrael, I don't know what it was, but anyway, they were all living in the house together. And somehow they managed, I don't know how, but my kol hakavod to my mother-in-law that she coped with all the cooking and all the rest of it. But their home was very, very hospitable at all times till the day that she was gone. Her home was always open to everybody. Now, Reverend Dorogov was the teacher, and he taught that he was also the shochet, and he ran the shul, and he had to teach the children in the cheder. The cheder room was a room in the shul. If I'm going too much, Gail, you must tell me if I'm if I'm doing too much. Is that okay?
No, that's okay. It's fine.
Okay. So he taught the children, and the boys were taught Gemara and Torah and everything. And the three boys that really, there weren't that many, but the three that stood out were Norman Spiro, my husband Noki Sher, and Gessie Borra. And all those three of them did land up in Israel. Now, at that time, of course, when Reverend Dorogov left the community, and we had to get someone to run the shul. They actually formed a committee before the shul. I forgot to mention that before the shul was built, they formed a committee, and you'll see a photograph of the members of the committee, and it's interesting to see the type of clothes and shoes they wore then. And it compiled of 6 people: Mr. Borra, Mr. Emden, Mr. Schuss, Solly Swirling, A.B. Sher, and Philip Sher. Those were the 6 members of the shul, and they decided on the purchase of the shul. Now I'll fast forward a little bit and just want to tell you that the neighbors of the people in the Goyim in Durbanville, the Afrikaans people, and the Shers all did business with the farming community, with the men, with the farmers. All of these people were so wonderful, and they were always, it was a wonderful feeling between the Jews and the Afrikaans people. And when I got married in 1953, I had to move into Durbanville, and I had to have these non-Jewish neighbors all around me. But I also had to go back in time because I didn't have a telephone until a year later. There weren't lines for us in our street, which was a new development, to get a telephone. And the telephone that you could use was those old-fashioned things that were stuck on the wall with a handle, and you would dial it. And if you remember the Afrikaans program on the radio, Nommer asseblief, you heard the person at the exchange say Nommer asseblief. You gave them the number, and then when he got through, he'd call you back, and that's how it was. So that was that. But, and also another thing, you know, there weren't many shops. You didn't have a choice of going to shops and going to choose, I'll go to this one or that one. There were three, what you call algemene handelaars. One was an Afrikaans man, and one was Spiro's store, which was a bigger one, and Schuss had a smaller one. And Harry Sachs also sold groceries and things, but not on the same scale. And then what they did over there was also sweet for that time. You know, you didn't order what you wanted. They would send this guy, Martinez, this colored guy on the bicycle, and he would come and order what you wanted, you know, what you needed. Now, what can 2 people want and a young couple need? So I said to him, I'll have a half a bread. And he went back and he brought me back the half a bread. So then I ran back to the shop to pay for it, for the 4.5 pennies it was in those years. And Mrs. Tennyson, who worked in the shop, she said to me, "Is jy mal? What doen jy here? Are you mad? What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, my mother said I must never eat anything that I haven't paid for. So here I am before I eat the bread." So these are all like little silly things that happen in a village. But
Vicky, can I just ask you, maybe you can now just for very briefly, because we've only got another 5 minutes, maybe
okay,
you can tell your story about, you know.
No, I'm going to go
happened.
to the next. Yeah, I'm going to do that now. In
Okay.
1970,
Thank you.
in 1970, I was on my way to a Brit with the family, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, and my 2 sisters-in-law. We were going to a Brit in Pinelands at the Vincent Pallotti. And on the way, I stopped at the Pinelands Cemetery. I was going to stop at the Pinelands Cemetery to go and to visit my parents' graves, because I had yahrzeit for them that week. And standing at the traffic light, a huge truck of stones. For those of you who know Goodwood, it was at the intersection where you went to the right, to the left, and I was standing at the traffic light there, and this huge truck of gravel, 7 tons of gravel, came flying to the back of our car, threw it into the mid-air, hit an electric light pole, And when it dropped to the ground, it was on fire. And the 3 passengers at the back, my mother-in-law, my 2 sisters-in-law, were instantly killed, and my father-in-law and I came out. Luckily, there was a policeman on his way to the airport. He came to pull us out of the car. And I was hysterical. I was in a terrible state. And my father-in-law turned around to me, and I will never forget what he said to me. I'll say it in Yiddish and then I'll translate it. He said to me, "Du sollst nicht schreien, das ist eine Gottsache." You mustn't shout, it's the will of God. Well, whoever will it was for me, it was a mini Holocaust. To lose 3 people in one smack like that was disastrous. And I must tell you there again, the Afrikaans people, they came in with such an output of feeling, of emotion. They were unbelievable. And then another incident that I had with an Afrikaans neighbor was in 1973, when the Munich massacre, it was Erev Rosh Hashanah, and there was a knock on my door, and there was my next door standing there, lady standing there. And she said, I called her inside, obviously. She said to me, "Jy weet, elke dag bid ons vir ons mense, maar vandag het ons vir julle mense gebid, om te dink dat mense gaan sport speel en kom terug in 'n visie." If you need a translation quickly, she says, "We pray every morning, but this morning we prayed for your people to think that such a disaster happened." And that was that. But now, just to quickly tell you about the community in Durbanville, we were a good community, and we used to raise funds for Israel and for different ways. And of course, our annual function for the shul was to have a big braai race on one of the farms, and sometimes there were 700 people at the evening. It was wonderful. And then for Israel, we used to raise in other ways. But the highlight of my personal life with the Women Zionist meetings, with the aid of Lis Rabinovitz and my daughter Avra, we put together an exhibition. We were asked to put up an exhibition of Jewish artifacts and anything related to Israel. And we put up a beautiful exhibition which lasted for 3 days in the town hall of Durbanville. No charge for it. People came, they brought the children from the schools to come and see it. It looked like a mini Judaica section of the Israel Museum and the ethnography department. And that's the last thing that I have to give up now, I suppose. That was the last thing that I did for Durbanville. And then 2 years later, Noki and I, in the next following year, we left Durbanville, and 2 years later, we went to live in Israel. And I've been here now for 41 years. And I look back to Durbanville with love, with sweet memories, with loving memories. And I just hope that the shul will never become, I just forgot to do, can I just quickly add about the Torah?
I'm wondering, I think that what we can do though, Vicky, is, we can refer everybody to your memoir, and we can just say very briefly that you actually managed your family to bring the Torah to Israel, and it's in Jerusalem now, and it's in memory of your family, because we need to move on.
But Gail, can I just tell them about what happened at the airport? That's very, very nice.
Okay.
Neil, my son Neil, decided that when there were no more shurs left in Durbanville and the community were becoming defunct, he arranged to go to Cape Town, and he organized to get the shul, the Torah, to come to Israel. And he got someone to bring it through to Johannesburg. I'm cutting it very short because there's a rush here. And when he got to El Al, for this person who was bringing it to Israel, when he came to El Al insisted that he had to unroll the whole Torah to see that there was nothing inside. When he unrolled it, all the staff of El Al started dancing and singing around the Torah. And then the people who were passengers started clapping and dancing as well. And that's how the Torah was brought with joy and simcha to Israel. And when it got here, it was brought with joy and simcha into the shul in Ramot, My children, grandchildren, and grandchildren have had the zchut, the privilege to have their bar mitzvahs from that Torah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicky. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Really.
I'm sorry, Gail, about what happened.
No, you don't have to be sorry.
And I just want to can I quickly thank Geraldine for starting this whole thing, because I think it's an amazing achievement. Kol hakavod to you for as long as you live. May Hashem bless you to carry on. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Vicky.
you too, Gail.
Thank you. That's
Absolutely.
fine.
And
That's okay.
Gail is a wonderful partner. The more people are coming together to appreciate the history. And Vicky, it's very special to have your story, and what's more, to have you to tell it to us. So thank you to Gail and thank you to Vicky. A couple of short questions. David Bess, do you want to just quickly say something? And then Richard.
Yes, thank you, Geraldine. Very quickly, one thing my mother did tell me, you could see a picture of on the wall behind me, was that when she was growing up and the family traveled mostly by horse-drawn transport, that any trip from Malmesbury to Cape Town required a stopover for the night in Durbanville. So that just gives you an idea of the distance, what the distances meant to them on gravel roads. And of course, there must have been, as Vicky mentions, that degree of hospitality in Durbanville, where traveling Jewish families would have been welcome to spend the night. I doubt there were any hotels at that time. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Richard. Okay, you have to unmute.
Sorry, apologies. Just thank you, Vicky, for those delightful memories of Durbanville. Just to say something about the relationship between the communities, separate Jewish communities when it came to religion, but very closely integrated when it came to Zionism. And the first Zionist organization in the northern suburbs, which is founded in 1931, is the Women's Zionist Association, and it's the Women's Zionist Association of Parow, Belleville, and Durbanville. So close integration in the Zionist area, and it continues with the youth Zionist movements. The important youth Zionist movement in the 1940s and into the early 50s was the B'nai Zion, and the leader of the B'nai Zion is this very charismatic Norman Spiro, who comes from, he's one of your Belleville people, and he appears in Belleville and in Parow. And when I interviewed the people of that generation who grew up in Parow, the person they most remember is, of course, Norman Spiro, who, as you mentioned, goes on Aliyah to Israel. Earlier on, he had been a Machalnik. And of course, he's also, I think, very important history of bowling.
That's right. Right. But I just want to tell you that as far as Dr. Bass is concerned, all the Afrikaans people who knew my father-in-law, whether they were coming from Worcester or from Malmesbury or from wherever, they would never bypass Durbanville. They'd always come and visit Ups. I used to call him Upski. And so this shows that it was like a way station to go and stop in Durbanville. It was very nice. But Norman was a very special man. He was a very great friend of Noki's. And we used to see a lot of him when we came to live in Israel. He was a great guy. So but I also must tell you that when I came to live in Durbanville, we were not connected to anything in the northern suburbs. We were in a complete separate entity.
Okay.
And that's it.
Thank
it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Rose wanted to say something.
I just want to say two things, that Reverend Dorogov and my mother were cousins, and I actually didn't know that had been to Durbanville. I thought that he was always in Goodwood, and I remember him as being such a fine man, and his wife Ray as well. We used to go and have tea with them on Sunday afternoons, and even having tea with relatives on Sunday afternoons was the most boring thing that one could ever make one's children do. Going to have tea with Auntie Ray and Reverend Dorogov was like just a wonderful, warm experience. And the other thing I want to say about my recollection of Durbanville is that My Uncle Aby and his wife and 2 children lived there. And Uncle Aby had a huge fig tree in his garden. And I can still smell the figs today. We used to sit there and eat those figs under the tree until we were absolutely ill. But it was just wonderful. And I remember Durbanville as being very warm. And I remember Hilda Swirling and all these people. And Vicky, as you were talking, I like felt something like nostalgia that I haven't felt for a very long time. So thank you.
Well, I'm glad that I left a good tone like that for somebody good.
That's lovely. Thank you so much, Vicky. Thank you, Rose, and thank you to those who asked questions. I'd like to move on now to South African Jewish soldiers. And here I welcome Naomi Shamroth-Rappaport. I'm just wondering if the Shamroth is Leo Shamroth, who was a professor at Wits Medical School, but you'll be able to tell us. Naomi herself is a retired physician in work now with the Chaim Herzog Museum, working on Jewish soldiers in World War II in Latrin, Israel. It's a museum of the Jewish soldiers, collating data on the South African Jewish men and women who volunteered for the war. So, Naomi, the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Geraldine, for inviting me to partake today in this symposium. I am the daughter-in-law of the late Leo Shamroth. I'm married to his 3rd son. All 4 sons were doctors, and I was the only daughter-in-law who was a doctor and have retired, and I am living between Johannesburg and Israel. And I'm going to speak about the role of South African Jewish soldiers in World War II. I presume you can all see the screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So when we speak of Jewish history and the Second World War, what always comes to mind is the Holocaust and obviously the murder of 6 million Jews. But what is unrecognized is that 1.5 million Jews actually enlisted and volunteered in the Allied armies. 250,000 of them lost their lives while fighting in the war. Many were injured. And these people actually were fighting for the survival of the Jewish people, while the world was actually fighting for its freedom, territories, and borders. And the Chaim Herzog Museum of the Jewish Soldiers being established in Israel. It's due to open in October this year. It is named after Chaim Herzog, who actually was an Irish-born Jew and served with the British Army and the British intelligence during the war. And as you all know, he was the 6th president of Israel. And the museum is dedicated to all the Allied soldiers, which actually includes the Jews of South Africa. And we have many of them actually listed and shown in the exhibition. Now, in terms of South Africa, there were over 10,000 Jewish men and women who volunteered in the Union Defence Force over the course of the war. And they made up 10% of South Africa's Jewish population. So 1 in 10 men and women actually volunteered. And the question is, why did so many volunteer? It's important to note that they volunteered and weren't drafted as were soldiers in America and Britain and that. And it related to anti-Semitism in South Africa. In 1930, the Quota Act was passed, which denied East European entry into South Africa. We had a lot of anti-Semitic propaganda being spread amongst the community, particularly amongst the grey shirts. The last ship that was allowed to bring German Jewish refugees into South Africa was the SS Stuttgart in 1936. And in 1937, we had the Anti-Aliens Act, which now barred the immigration of Western European Jewish immigration. Within our government, we had people who supported the Nazis, and one of them was Oswald Pirro, who was our Minister of Defense. And here is a photograph of him taken in Berlin in 1938, flanked by the Luftwaffe. He declared that Hitler was perhaps the greatest man of the last 1,000 years. And it's not therefore surprising that we had so many Jews actually volunteer in the Union Defense Force. I'm showing you a few. The Jonas brothers, they came to South Africa as German Jewish refugees in 1936. They served in the war. The Levine family from Petersburg, 4 of the sons served, 3 in the Union Defense Force and Harold in the Royal Air Force. From Port Elizabeth, we had 3 brothers, Leo Wolfe and Ellie Merkin. 2 were doctors and 1 served in the engineering corps. And then we had from as far as Windhoek, in fact, the Klut siblings, there were 4 brothers and a sister who served in the Union Defense Force. So they were amongst our 10,000, sorry. Now, when war broke out, actually South Africa didn't go to war. It was South Africa was involved in defending the coast, and the South African Air Force, together with the Navy, were involved in guarding the Cape Sea route. Air schools were set up, which then provided 3 daily flights, and they were involved in convoy escorts and anti-submarine patrols. Now, I speak about this because within our air schools in South Africa, we had 14 Jewish casualties. I haven't listed all of them. I've listed 4 of them: Morris Flax, Kenneth Jacobs, Cyril D., and a young woman, Sylvia Joachim. She died in an aircraft accident while serving in the Union Defense Force in 1944. But with the outbreak of the war, actually, many South African Jews went off to England and enrolled there, and particularly within the Royal Air Force. And South Africa's first war victim actually was a Jew. It was pilot Harold Rozovsky, who was killed in September 1939 while serving in the Air Force, and it was an accident where they flew into trees. We then had Norman Lewis, who died in December of 1939. He was killed on a mission to bomb ships, the Leipzig and Nuremberg, over Germany, and their plane crashed into the sea. There were 16 other South African airmen who died while serving in the RAF, and I'm showing you 3 of them. Jack Folkson died in June of 1940. He had been involved in the Battle of Narvik in Norway and was killed with 9 other pilots when the aircraft carrier they were on was actually sunk by the Germans. Frederick Posnier, he died during the Battle of Britain. He was shot down by the Luftwaffe. And Jocelyn Friendly, he was the first non-commissioned officer to get the Distinguished Flying Medal. He received it in 1941 when he was working or serving as a bomb aimer and navigator. And he unfortunately died in May of 1943 over France when his plane was shot down by flak over Normandy. Now, in terms of the South African Defense Force, or the Union Defense Force, as it was correctly named, they actually partook in 3 main campaigns: the East Africa campaign, the North African campaign, and the Italian campaign. And I'm going to just spend a little bit of time talking about each of these campaigns. So in East Africa, South Africa got involved after Italy declared war in June of 1940, and the next day South Africa then declared war. And the Italians had overrun British Somaliland, which you see over there, and British Morali. And the South African troops were there under Lieutenant General Alan Cunningham. And his biggest problem in terms of the war in East Africa was that the troops had to cross several hundred miles of waterless desert. And these photographs here give you an idea of the terrain that these South Africans had to traverse and fight in. And here is a map. It shows you the routes that the South Africans took, going through Italian Somaliland and through to Addis Ababa. The Springboks actually liberated Addis Ababa. And 4 Jewish men received the MBE for the work they did in East Africa. 2 of them, Joseph Lensner and Disraeli Levenkind, were involved in supplying water to the troops. They were part of the water supply companies number 36 and 33, and they got the MBEs for this. Hyman Sampson was a doctor, and he received the MBE as he was involved in setting up field stations, medical stations to cater for the soldiers, and Leopold Steyn was involved in the 3rd Armored Car Campaign. There obviously were casualties and many others who received awards, but I'm not going to go through that because of a restriction of time. But in terms of the East African campaign, it actually was a successful campaign. And the 1st South African Infantry Division, which served in East Africa, now moved up to North Africa. They were sent to a place called Mersa Matruh, and they were then joined by the South African 2nd Division, which came, and they were stationed at El Alamein in 1941. And initially, these 2 divisions weren't involved in fighting, which had been taking place in Libya between the 8th Army and the Axis Force. Now, Tobruk was under siege at that time, and that's over here with the little red dot. And the importance of Tobruk was that it was a vital port that the Allies needed to have supplies into Libya. Now, the 8th Army, which was made up of the Allied soldiers, which included the South Africans, then partook in a battle at Sidi Rezeg towards the end of 1941. Now, what was the importance of Sidi Rezeg? Sidi Rezeg was about 10 miles south of Tobruk, and it was the forward air base for the Western defense of Western Libya. And it was now under the control of the Axis forces. And the battle took place on the 23rd of November, 41, and thousands would die within sight of the airstrip. This is a busy slide. It's actually from an article done by David Katz, and it's the order of the battle. I don't expect you to go through it, but the reason I'm showing it to you is that one of the infantry brigades, which was the 5th Infantry Brigade, was basically annihilated in this battle. And amongst them were many Jews. 14 Jewish soldiers were killed in this battle. The ones that have got asterisks next to them were actually German Jewish refugees who had come to South Africa and joined up in the forces. And here is a photograph of the cemetery, Knightsbridge Cemetery, which is where the soldiers who died at Sidi Rezeg are buried, and it gives you an idea of how many were actually killed in this battle. There were numerous who received awards, and I'm just going to mention one, Lionel Meltzer, a doctor. He received the Military Cross during this battle, and he received it because he set an example to the stretcher bearers and orderlies who were all working in the open without cover or protection of any kind, despite there being crossfire coming through the main dressing station. He received this. Another one I'll just mention, which I haven't got a slide of, is Frank Solomon, the son of Bertha Solomon, who happened to be the first woman member of parliament in South Africa. And amongst those who were taken prisoner was a young fellow, Bernard Friedlander. He was captured, and he was one of 2,200 POWs who were crowded into the hold of an Italian cargo ship, the Sebastiana Venero, on December 8th of December 41 at Benghazi. They were going to be sent to Italy. And the next day, on the 9th of December, the ship was torpedoed by the British HMS Porpoise. 430 POWs were killed in this incident, including 8 South African Jewish soldiers. Now, when the ship was torpedoed, the Italian crew abandoned ship. They left everyone aboard the ship, prisoners, and the ship ended up beaching on rocks in stormy sea. This is a photograph taken from the shore, where it beached close to Methonian Castle. And numerous of the POWs attempted to swim ashore, but were unsuccessful. Friedlander volunteered. It took him 90 minutes with a rope tied around his waist to eventually get to shore. A cable was then attached to the rope, and every prisoner of war, including the wounded, were evacuated off the ship. This incident was actually observed by a German officer, and Friedlander was subsequently awarded the George Medal. In fact, he made the headlines in South Africa of the rescue by a gallant South African corporal and the ordeal of 1,200 Springbok prisoners in torpedoed ships. The others were Australians and New Zealanders and British. Now, getting back to North Africa, the next battle was the Battle of Bardia, and Bardia is here on the border between Egypt and Libya. And this was the first battle that the 2nd South African Division were involved in. Up to that time, they had not actually been involved in any fighting. And this took place on New Year's Eve of December 1941. And unfortunately, again, there were numerous Jewish soldiers. There were 12 of them who were killed. The majority were from the Imperial Light Horse, which had a lot of Jewish soldiers and was actually nicknamed Israel's Last Hope. And amongst them, we once again had a German Jewish refugee, Ludwig Baumann, who lost his life. Again, in this battle, there were Jewish men who received awards. This is Gerald Goddard. He received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. And this is taken from a newspaper. They actually had interviewed his commanding officer who had written to the parents and had written that their son was acting in a section where they were involved in battle. The platoon had come under heavy fire from the Germans. 16 members were killed, including the officer and sergeant. Many were wounded, and only 9 men were left. And Gerald Goddard took command of these men, and they charged this pillar box at the point of a bayonet, and they captured the position and then continued on to their next objective. And he received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. There was another one, Morris Meyer Roberts, who also received an award during this battle. And in fact, following on Bardia, the Allied forces did well. They drove the Axis forces westward. However, the Axis counteroffensive was far stronger, and they pushed the 8th Army back to El Alamein, which was 80 miles from Alexandria. And although Tobruk had been relieved when the British had their drive, Tobruk was now surrounded. And in fact, it was under the command of Major General Kloppers, who surrendered to the Germans on the 21st of June, 1942. 32,200 Allied forces were taken captive, of which 10,720 were South Africans. 750 of these were Jewish soldiers. And this fall of Tobruk actually was a disaster. It was the second largest capitulation by the British Army after the fall of Singapore. And in terms of South African military history, was the biggest defeat in the history of the Union Defence Force. So as I mentioned, the 8th Army was pushed all the way back to El Alamein. And on the 23rd of October 1942, this successful opening push occurred. And here is a photograph. It's taken from a soldier, Lance Corporal Ruben Gluckman. He had fought at Sidi Rezeg, managed to escape to Broek. And these are from his personal album. And he wrote about the opening shot on the night of the successful push. An artillery barrage actually opened the battle. That night, the South African artillery fired 62,000 rounds of 25-pounder ammunition, and then the infantry went in. This is from a diary of a young doctor, Morris Epstein. He was assigned to the 12th Squadron South African Air Force, and I'm just going to read his entry from October 24. That's the day after the night when the push started. He wrote, "The show is on. We sent out 42 sorties from our squadron. 3 planes failed to return. I don't think that a single plane escaped damage of some sort. Every plane was holed, and some of the escapes were amazing." And he goes on to write, "At least 6 planes were complete write-offs, although the crews were untouched." And at El Alamein, there were 4 South Africans who received awards, 2 MBEs, both of them were actually part of the South African Engineering Corps. Basil Canty, he was responsible for the gun placements at El Alamein and for the repair of the roads, the bomb craters. Harold Marcus was responsible for ensuring that the 8th Army had sufficient supplies once the offensive started, and they would have enough supplies to continue westwards. 2 doctors received the Military Cross. Gerald Dyson, who was from Standerton, was serving with the Royal Army Medical Corps, and Louis Babro with the South African Medical Corps. In fact, both of these men were injured during this battle. But I'm just going to tell you about a little anecdote about Louis Babro. Louis Babro was a South African rugby player. And he told the story that 2 days before the Battle of Alamein began, a rugby match was actually organized between the South African and the New Zealanders, which was used as a ploy of the 8th Army Command to fool the Germans. The German recce planes flew over Alamein. They saw this rugby match in progress, and they returned to report that no Allied push was about to take place. In fact, they were killing each other in a strange game of football. And that was his anecdote. And in fact, following the opening offensive in October 23, the British Army ended up pushing the Axis forces eastward and westward, and in fact, eventually the Axis forces left North Africa, and it was partly also due to the combination of the South African Army, which fought with the 8th Army. Now, in terms of the Italian campaign, what happened was the South African infantry brigades that had served in North Africa, many of the soldiers returned to South Africa, and the 6th South African Armored Division was then formed in February 1943 with new recruits and those from the infantry divisions who had served in North Africa and East Africa. And after they completed their training in Egypt, the division then went off to Taranto, Italy in in April of 44. And here is a map of showing you where the South Africans landed and the course through Italy. There's a photograph of our troops having arrived in Taranto on the 20th of April, 44. Now, I'm not going to go through every battle, but I'm going to just mention two in Italy. And one related to Monte Cassino. Monte Cassino was situated by the Gustav Line. This was a line of defense set up by the Germans to prevent the Allied forces advancing on Rome. And there were 4 battles that took place at Monte Cassino. Please note the photograph of the village. This was during one of the early battles, showing some bombing of the village. This is after the 4th battle, what Monte Cassino looked like. And a South African Major, David Gonski, received the MBE at this battle, the 4th battle. He had been in this Union Defence Force and then was seconded to the 26th British Liaison Unit, which was attached to the Polish Corps. In fact, Gonski had come to South Africa as a child from Poland and was fluent in Polish. And he and his brother were attached to the Polish Corps. And I'm going to read to you what his grandson wrote about his grandfather. And he said, what I remember most about Grandpa Dan, aside from his medals and memorabilia, was an account of the Battle of Monte Cassino. That was when he, an officer leading Polish troops in British uniform, fought alongside an army of Indian, New Zealand, French-speaking African and American soldiers against Germans on top of a mountain in Italy. Grandpa's memories of the war stuck with him, even haunted him, and he always wanted to share them with those who would listen. I remember asking him once if he had killed anyone during the war. I remember that he paused before he answered that question, telling me that he had shot several soldiers. He did not call them enemies. His response made me think about the human tragedy of the war. South Africans continued northwards, and one of the next obstacles was the Gothic line in the Apennine Mountains. And the Gothic line had been built again to prevent the Allies advancing into the industrialized and developed area of North Italy. And many of us were not aware of a massacre known as the Monte Sole massacre, which took part in October 1944, when the German and Austrian SS troops were ordered to purge the villages of Monte Sole area. They were mountain villages where the villagers were suspected of supplying Italian partisans. And over a course of 2 days, the SS troops started to massacre the populations, and they were interrupted on the 4th of October by a group of Allied soldiers who were actually the South African Armored Division, and they drove the Nazis back behind the Gothic line, saving the remaining people of Monte Sole. And here is actually a photograph of South African tanks actually firing on positions of Monte Sole.
Just a couple of minutes now.
Yeah, I'm finishing off. You've got 2 more slides. And in fact, in northern Italy, in this area is a cemetery at Castiglione dei Pepoli. It's actually called the 6th South African Armored Division because the majority of soldiers who are buried there are South Africans, and amongst them are 8 Jewish men. There were many who were wounded. And this slide is very busy, but this is a list of the South Africans who got awards. I've mentioned Lionel Meltzer in North Africa. He then got the OBE for the work he did in Italy. I've mentioned Gonski to you, who's above, and I'm finishing off with the only woman who received an MBE, and her name was Sylvia Rosenberg. And she had started off in the Union Defence Force as a lorry driver, and she then became the personal secretary to Robert Casey, who was the Australian Minister of State in the Middle East. She became the acting secretary to Lord Moyane, and then she went to Italy, where she was personal assistant to Field Marshals Wilson and Alexander. And if you read her citation, you will understand that she was responsible for preventing conflict between the British and the Americans in terms of what was going to happen in Europe. And she received the MBE. So my last slide is to summarize. We had over 10,000 Jewish men and women who enlisted in the Union Defence Force. 357 soldiers died. 327 were injured. I mentioned the 750 who were captured at Tobruk, and in fact, a number of them joined the partisans. And many South Africans were awarded various decorations. But the idea, and what I want to emphasize, is that every soldier who partook in the war effort actually was a hero and needs to be commemorated. And that is what the Museum of the Jewish Soldier, the Chaim Herzog Museum of the Jewish Soldier of World War II, is endeavoring to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. That's fascinating. As you know, I looked at the Kimberley Jews who signed up. One interesting story is that after the Battle of Monte Cassino, where they were involved, they actually walked into Rome, but they were not allowed to do that.
The Americans.
They turned back and they had to let the Americans take Rome. So
Correct.
we've got the picture of Cecil Cohen in Rome before it was announced that they'd captured Rome.
Correct.
Thank you very much. Now, a couple of people want to ask questions. Shirley Gilbert wants to say something. Shirley, if you'll unmount. Unmount. This is war.
Thank you, Geraldine. And thank you, Naomi, for the work that you're doing to document this piece of South African Jewish history that we don't know very much about, and the work of the museum. It's really interesting to learn about it. So I had just a comment and a quick question. So the comment was just to say that if we kind of zoom out and put this in a larger historical perspective, that actually this phenomenon of Jews volunteering in huge numbers to serve in the militaries of the countries where they live is a common phenomenon at the end of the 19th century, and then especially around the First World War and then the Second World War, because it's a way of, in an era where they've, finally been granted civil and political rights, it's a way for them to express their patriotism. So it makes sense in the South African case that that's very much what they're doing, showing themselves to be contributing and valuable members of South African society. And that fits especially for the German Jewish refugees who are coming in the 30s, who we know turned out in especially large numbers to volunteer, to enlist, even though they'd only arrived in the 30s. And I was particularly struck by the number of times you mentioned German Jews in what you had been speaking about. And I wondered whether for the museum and the research work that you're doing for the museum, whether you have materials relating to these people. I'm particularly interested in the German Jews because that's who I'm writing about. But I wondered, do you have family papers and photographs, and where are you finding these stories?
Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background, I got involved in the museum when the curator phoned me in South Africa, and he said to me, we've actually got very little information about the South Africans. They had 20 names. And he said, please, could I help them? I'd actually done a book about an uncle who was taken POW, and it's actually on the website. It's called Letters in a Shoebox. So I started, and it was quite difficult to find lists of names. There was a book published by the Jewish Board of Deputies in 1950, which I got hold of, and I used that actually. Those who had died, it was easy because you've got memorial plaques. You've got it at the South African Military History Museum. We've got it at West Park Cemetery. And in fact, there's a project called the South African War Graves Project, which gives a lot of details about the South Africans who died in the war. And as I was going through it, then I managed to connect up people, because we found when we enter names, we enter the parents' names, and then suddenly you find brothers who died that weren't connected up. But to cut a long story short, I used the book of the Board of Deputies. I read through it, made a note of every single name. There are lists of those who got awards. There's lists of those who were injured. There's this or wounded, those mentioned in dispatch. Now, when we do the profiles of these people, it's not just to list a name. What I've done is to try and trace that person. And I've used genealogical sites such as Genie, My Heritage, Ancestry, and I've sent messages to people and said to me, tell me about the person you've got listed. And through them responding back to me, I've actually got information, and in fact, I've got photographs that they've sent me about the families. And that's actually how I've been doing it. I've been going through every individual that I can trace. And the interesting thing in terms of South African jury is I've had people from Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Britain, the Netherlands, who've actually responded back to me and sent me information about the families. So it's been a process that I've been doing for, in fact, it's now over 2 years of tracing people. And that's the way we do it. And what's interesting on the German Jews is on Genie, there's a fellow by the name of Tom Fuhl, who's been trying to locate the Jews who left. And I've then been adding on the South Africans who I've picked, or those who came to South Africa. And there's that whole project of the Stoppoostene. And from there, you pick up information. So I've got a neighbor whose grandfather came to South Africa, and he said to me his father fought in the Union Defence Force, but could only be sent out of the country after he received his naturalization papers. And I then went and I found on Genie about the grandmother and the Stoppoostene, and in the description, they give you the whole history of the family up to the time they left Germany. They just said went to Africa. So you get it in detail. So every South African that has been listed on the website, I've done about 2,800 so far. And if you want information, I can give you on everyone who we've listed who has been a German Jewish refugee who's come to South Africa.
Thanks. Can you put on the chat maybe the website of the museum, and then people
Okay. If you just Google Chaim Herzog Museum, you're going to come up with it. The official language of the museum is Hebrew, but they're using 3 languages, English, Hebrew, and Russian, because there were 500,000 Russian soldiers who partook in the war. And if you click on the British flag, you will get the original English on it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
David, you had a question. If you can keep the questions brief.
I'll try and keep this very brief. Thank you, Geraldine. Naomi Shamroth, Colin Shamroth, Naomi's husband, and I met in 1979 when the two of us were unwilling conscripts into uniform rather than volunteers, and we go back that distance. Naomi's well aware of an uncle of mine who was killed in Italy in 1944. Right. And it just ties up with another theme of this meeting today, because my uncle, Nathan Cohen, grew up in Malmesbury and was probably one of the first Jews from Malmesbury to visit Israel. He was captured at Tobruk, managed to escape, and then linked up with the Allied forces, by which time he was so badly sunburned, he was sent to Israel to recuperate. So I have a lovely picture of him posing in front of one of the government buildings in Tel Aviv. But I'll share that at another time. What's of great significance is that he was killed in Italy on the 11th of July, 1944, and today is then the 79th anniversary of his death. So once again, a little coincidence that ties up with some of the other themes. Thank you for letting me mention that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Charlotte, unmute and you can say what you mean.
I just want to know if you're still looking for information. I've got a book here by Gideon Sassa. He wrote his memoirs and it's all about his time in North Africa. He's a Jewish soldier from Petersburg. I don't know if you're interested in it.
Absolutely. We're trying to get the 10,000 names. That's what we're trying to do, to list you.
So what must I do? Bring it to the museum?
Please contact me. Charlotte, you're sitting in Netanya, if I'm not. Yes, in fact, I spoke to your husband, Dennis, and he was going to send me information on your father-in-law, who also partook in the war, if I'm not mistaken. I'm still waiting.
All right, okay, I'll speak to him also. All right.
And please, we might have Sassa listed. I can't remember every single name.
Yeah.
But he might be listed. I can check. Just send me an email and we'll see what's there. Okay. In fact, just out of interest on the Petersburg community, Selwyn Levine, Scully Levine, sat down with me and we did a profile on his father who flew in the RAF. And in fact,
Harold, yes.
Harold was based in Burma in India and then partook in the battles in Western Europe. And we've done a beautiful profile on him with photographs that he had from Burma and some from the battles in Europe.
Oh, great. Okay, I'll come and visit the museum.
Yeah, contact me because, as I say, I've been helping them do the South Africans, and then I send it on to the curator, and he then does a bit of a translation into Hebrew, but we keep the original English.
So put your email in the chat as well. And you know that for Kimberley, on the memoirs page of the poll now and on the Kimberley thing, we listed nearly 50 people and with stories brought and pictures that their families had given us, so that each one is a little picture.
Correct.
You've seen that, yes?
Yes, I used your Kimberley soldiers, your articles to list them. And just interesting, there are two brothers who are actually, there was the book done on the Southwest African Jews, and David Sachs kindly gave me that information, and I've actually listed those from Southwest Africa who fought. And we've now working on Zimbabwe and Zambia and that, and working through communities.
Okay, Richard.
I'm just wondering, thank you, and Naomi, for that fascinating talk. I'm just wondering whether you've been in contact with or accessed the archives of the South African National Defence Forces, which are outside of Pretoria. They built a new museum archive complex, and it has the full records of every South African who ever served in the South African National Defence Forces. So
absolutely, Richard. The biggest,
served, you'll find the records of every one of them, which include the attestation papers, which give full details about them, and also, of course, the service records. And in the case of Parow, Rose has mentioned her father, Louis Leroux, who won the military medal in North Africa. There were also Walter Levy, one of these Jews I already mentioned, German Jew, who served as well. And most interestingly, a woman called Laura Friedberg, who married into a very large and important Parow family, who has a fascinating war. She serves in a very secret unit on the Cape Coast, which is responsible for the radar installations, looking out for German submarines operating off the coast.
Thank you. Just to get back about the Defence Force archives, I've been sending them emails, some of them waiting for a year. Unless you've got some contact within the actual archive to go in, it's impossible to try and get the papers. Peter Bailey, who is a South African military historian, has been working with me in Israel. It's an interesting story because I contacted Peter about a profile of an uncle on Genie. And I said, what role did your uncle have in the war? And he said, why are you asking me this? And I said, I'm working for the museum. Now, Peter's lived in Israel for 10 years and he wasn't aware of the museum. And I've introduced him actually to the museum. And Peter has contacts there, but even so, we have problems accessing documents. The other thing that one has got to understand, for example, prisoners of war, the documents would just say taken prisoner of war, and then you'll have repatriated on this day, but no information is given there. Another problem we have is, for example, awards. So if you got, for example, an award from the British government, it's not reflected in the actual South African military documents. And there's a fascinating story of a fellow by the name of Bernard Schulman, who was taken prisoner of war, who received the Omnibus award. And if you read between the lines, he was sent to a concentration camp in Germany, where in fact they were involved in building the Junker planes and producing rockets. And he received the award because he was responsible for bringing out 1,500 Allied prisoners of war out of the camp and marching them westwards. And even though the Allied armies were busy bombing them, and he received this award. And when we looked at his military documents, there was not a single thing written about him. He's buried at West Park Cemetery, died in the 1960s. I can't tell you who his parents are, we can't track it, but we've actually got him listed. So there are some amazing, amazing stories.
Fantastic. Rose Lira, can you unmute?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, and that is that my father was awarded the military medal, and he was also mentioned in the dispatches. And Naomi, if you go to page 39 of the Board of Deputies book, you can read the story about my father.
I'm sure we've got him listed. I'm sure he's listed. If he got a medal, he's listed on the website. So if
I'll have a look, but I've got some pictures and things. And I've got a lot of his pictures from the war, and I should come to the museum or should meet you and show them to you, and perhaps they can be of use to you.
Yeah, and in fact, what we'll do is then, what we've done is if we've listed someone and we get more information, we add it on. We add it on.
Okay, I also have his medals.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Naomi. I think you elicited a lot of interest, and your museum is very worthwhile. I'd like now, Veronica, if you don't mind, to take Malmesbury first, because Brahmi has to go to a meeting that he can't miss. So if you don't mind, we'll go out of order and we'll introduce the website of the Malmesbury Jewish community. And so I'm going to introduce you to Brahmi Lenhoff. Brahmi, are you ready?
Yep. And if you do want to go back to the original order, I'm quite happy to have you and Steve handle Malmesbury.
Well, I think it would be helpful to Steve if you're there in the background. So if that's okay. It
will be for 5 minutes or so.
And And so Steve is here as well, and Steve is the inspiration for the Malmesbury website. You want to get up in the meantime, Brahmi, the whole website, so we can show where to go from there. I'll just say that Steve Albert has been going around the Western Cape doing a lot of research, and he's the inspiration. You know, one of the other people who said, look, I don't want all the stuff lingering in my files or in my head. I'd like it to go somewhere where people can find it. So, you know, fortunately, through Gail's inspiration for sharing stories, we've made a place. And the place is under the auspices, thank goodness, of the Kaplan Center and the South African Jewish Museum. And everything you can find that you need, you can see all the stories, you can see the memoirs, there are presentations, everything we've done, you could just click there and you can find previous presentations if you want to listen to them. And communities, we've listed now a whole lot of communities, and we're going to just click on the Malmesbury page, and then I'd like to introduce Steve Albert. And Steve, if you will tell us about your history.
Sure. If I could just actually just interrupt and mention this other site here is also Steve's. It's a blog of his that covers Western Cape synagogues, but Steve has an enormous repository of information, and so he was the driving force behind the Malmesbury one, which I'll go to now. But Geraldine, we may need to have you or Steve share the Malmesbury, because as I said, I'm afraid I have to leave in a few minutes.
Oh.
Okay, so Steve, where do you want to go? What I can do is, while you're talking about yourself, I can put up the site, and then, or would you like to do it yourself?
Well, just to mention that I've got load shedding at 4 o'clock, so I don't know how long I'll be able to be here for. So maybe you should do the sharing just in case I.
Okay, so Brahmi, stop sharing your screen. Steve, you talk to us, and I'll share the screen with us.
Okay, I just want to put my volume up a little bit. It's a bit soft.
Even I are almost like the country communities. We're going to vanish.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'll try and get this in before the government cuts me off. So I've been working with Geraldine and Brahmi quite a lot on the Malmesbury site, building the Malmesbury site, and also as well on the Stellenbosch site as well. The areas that I'm involved in is really about the synagogues and museums, the cemeteries, as well as some general background community information as well. So basically my story, quite a few years back, I researched and documented not quite all, but pretty close to all the synagogues and Jewish cemeteries in the Western Cape. I traveled to about 30 towns. There were synagogues in about half of them, and cemeteries in probably about half of those again. So I traveled to this, I researched which towns had Jewish communities, where there were synagogues, and in most of the towns that I visited, the synagogues were still standing. I think there were only about 3 synagogues that were no longer around anymore. I photographed the synagogues, the exteriors, if there were any special features, like if they had stained glass windows or special features. I photographed the foundation stones. Where I was able to, I also photographed the interior of the shuls as well. Some of them were private homes. Caledon and Somerset West, for example, were private homes. The owners of these two houses actually let me into their homes, and I photographed in Somerset West what remained of the Aron Kodesh at the back. Some of them, such as Malmesbury, as we'll see in Bram's presentation, as you know, are now town museums, the same as in Piketberg and Calvinia. So where there were town museums and they had displays of the Jewish communities, I photographed the displays, the cabinets, the artifacts, the panels, whatever they had about the Jewish communities. I photographed all of that. Some of the towns like Darling and Riversdale, they were sort of general town museums, but they still had a display on the history of the Jewish communities. So there as well, I photographed all those displays and artifacts and all the bits and pieces that they had. I also photographed all the cemeteries that I could get access to. I know I didn't get into Paarl, and there were a couple that I missed sort of later in my research, but generally wherever I could get into the Jewish cemeteries, I photographed all the tombstones in these Jewish cemeteries as well. And so essentially my routes that I traveled was from Cape Town, traveling up north along sort of the west coast, through places like Darling, Malmesbury, Piketberg, all the way up as far as Van Reinsdorp, and then to the north, not to the north, to that side, to the right, Calvinia, which actually is in the Northern Cape. In the inland area, I did all the winelands, Stellenbosch, Paarl, Worcester, Wellington, those sort of towns, all the way through up to Laingsburg. And on the bottom areas, sort of the southern area of the Western Cape, through places like Hermanus and Riversdale, as far eastward as Uniondale. And much the same in Cape Town itself as well. I only photographed the old buildings, both in Cape Town, sort of central Cape Town itself, so places like Obbs Mowbray, Muizenberg, Wynberg, some of the ones in Sea Point, Old Roland Street Synagogue as well, and to the outlying areas as well. So I photographed, and I was given access into the old Parow Synagogue. I photographed the interior of that. I have also photographed all the synagogues that were spoken about earlier, the Goodwood, Durbanville, and Belleville synagogues as well. So in Cape Town, probably around about 12 or 13 synagogues that I managed to get data from and photographs. And I also got a lot of data from the archives, the national libraries, even in the little towns themselves. So wherever I could get any kind of documentation, if it was a newspaper article, old photographs, or any old sort of documentary evidence, I gathered all that. So I have built up a reasonable sized file of all this information. So we'll see when Bram takes us through the Malmesbury site, a lot of this data can now get into the websites that we're building for Malmesbury. So hopefully I can put a lot of those other communities and synagogues into websites like this one.
Thanks, Steve, because your work has been amazing, and now we've got all the stuff. So, Bramy, are you there still? Or you had to?
Bramy said he had to leave.
Yeah,
in the chat.
Okay, so I'll just sort of click on the pages. Maybe Steve, you want to say something about the pages. So the home page, of course, just says, this is who we are and this is who you contact, and I'll be pleased to hear from you. Do you want to talk about the timeline?
Sure. So the timeline basically is the chronological history of the community, when the community started, running through sort of major events, the first minyan, when they first acquired a Sefer Torah, when the synagogue was built, when the cemetery was first established. And we've got some fantastic photographs of the old synagogue there, which are some great photographs. These aren't mine, but they're still lovely anyway. and really going through the history, obviously the history of most of these towns is the same. Sort of they thrived they arrived at, very early on in the 1900s. They would thrive through the 20s, 30s, maybe 40s, and start dying off in the 1950s to 60s, really. The people page is basically stories about people from these towns. There's a bit of a general overview on the top there, and wherever we have stories of these individuals, there'll be a link to an article or a story or a letter or something like this. So these are all stories that have been contributed to the site. We've got quite a few really nice old stories here now.
Well, this is thanks to David Bass, who's with us today. He has sent the story, and here's his uncle, Nathan, who was killed in Florence in his uniform. The family story and pictures that he sent that we've put into this nice story. So thanks to him. Also, Colin Robinson, who can't be here today because he's just flying into Cape Town. His family are the Berman family. And the interesting thing about them was that his grandfather, Jankel Berman, was walking from Cape Town to Malmesbury, probably didn't have a nice stopover in Durbanville, and was nearly dead on the farm Rosenberg, just outside Malmesbury, when the farmer, Piet van der Westhuizen, found him, nursed him back to health, to life, and was very taken with his story as a refugee from Lithuania, and so started the incredible relationship between the Van der Westhuizen, and this is an article that Colin found in a paper where the Van der Westhuizens are talking about the Bermans. So interesting to have that story because, as you probably know, it was Piet van der Westhuizen who eventually gave the ground for the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery. Okay, so we haven't got activities yet.
So yeah, the synagogue page again is focused on the shul, a bit of the history about it, and some of the photographs that we have. Here's the foundation stone. Last page. Yeah, so this here is the old shul hall, or the Talmud Torah. And that's what the nice detail is that the Magen David in the air vent or the window, whatever it is there. But in fact, we've actually got another photograph which somebody sent in, I forget who it was, of that synagogue in, I think, the 1930s, an original black and white of that synagogue. As you can see now, it's been built on, and it's looking a bit worse for the way, well, when I went. I don't even know how it looks now. But that picture that we have is a much nicer picture of that building in use as a function in the 1930s, which is a lovely picture.
It's David who sent the picture.
Okay.
It might be his parents' wedding.
Could be. It's a fantastic photograph either way. Lovely photograph. Is this the spreadsheet? Yeah, so this actually is Brahmi's spreadsheet with the full cemetery listing, which I think you can arrange in certain ways. If you just select a different sort order, you can sort the
If you want to see what age people were when they died, where we know it, you've got to.
And I think these photographs are then attached to the photograph. These names are attached to the photographs of the headstones. I think, yeah.
So this is what Brahmi's done, taking it from the Jewish Roots Bank, and he's created this table where you can link to every stone. And if you want to check on the first name, the date of death, you know, it's all searchable. And so that's the cemetery page. Now, so there's a page for articles, and what have we got here?
So the articles, these are some of the, like for instance, the articles that were linked to family stories in the People's page. These are the articles that are linked here. For example, there's the letters from your grandfather to his wife.
There's a whole like little website of that, which we've been able just to link to, which you can go to from there. There was somebody gave a talk about the Malmesbury tornado, and they showed a picture of what had happened to the main street, which was where all the Jewish businesses were. So the Dip Rafia became a Dip Rafia for a while. Otherwise, they used to refer to it as the Sluit. Is that right, David? And
that's quite right, yes.
This is the leaflet of the museum, which Steve has put in there. You can read the whole leaflet of the museum. So images we've put here, and David Bass has put something up which is amazing, which we hope you'll take your time to look at, which is a video that he took of the opening of the museum. So there's, you know, speeches, there's and his mother talking about the history of everything. Very elegant Mother Bertha Bass talking there. And to contact, you know, this is the same for every town. Fill in your details, and then we can start that to become your family story. So there we have a template for museum. Thanks so much to Steve for all the stuff he's collected, and to Graeme for patiently putting it all up and sorting it all out. So anybody who wants to make a website, this won't be of the quality that Richard is making, but on the other hand, it does keep a community together and bring it to life. So anybody got any questions for Steve or me about this? And one thing I can say to you is, if you want to go back to the community history website, this goes right back to the website, and you can then go to the stories, which we've listed now. How many stories, Gail?
82 so far, but I've got quite a lot to learn to post. Everyone's invited to send stories if you like writing. It's just basically people who like writing nonfiction stories, usually about themselves or whatever they want. Then I just, you know, edit them a little bit, and it's great fun. And I've discovered some fabulous stories and people.
The thing about stories is they fill that gap between history and biography. They tell you something more. You get the smell and the feel and the emotion of the event. So it's really valuable to have that. We also have memoirs, and there's actually some military ones. There's which is the one here? Well, the Kimberley Jews in the Second World War is there. And that's probably a very typical picture Naomi of the camel, sitting soldiers on the camels. And there's Harris Green, who wrote about his father. So there's a story there.
Some
So,
lovely memoirs too, yeah.
so there.
Anyway.
Okay, that we just have to close. And the presentation. So here you'll find the stories. If you want to know, hear authors reading their stories, you can click on these presentations. These are our seminars, the ones that say Colic. And here's the stories. You'll be able to see Gail and all the story readers. So it's nice to get a little bit in of talking about this whole website. So I'm going to stop share now. And thanks, Dee, very much for this. And then I think we'll call Veronica to talk to us about the very important and special work that she's been doing. So Veronica, if you can get ready to try and show your website, I will just tell everybody who mostly they probably know that Dr. Veronica Belling was the original librarian at the Captain Center, where she worked for 31 years. And here she compiled her bibliography of South African Jewry in 1997. And she's the author of The History of Yiddish Theatre in South Africa from 2008. She has translated several books from Yiddish into English for the Kaplan Center, including Liebel Friedman's Yidden in Johannesburg, as well as writing various communal histories and many academic articles. So, Veronica, it's great to have you to do this. And now, share your screen.
Yeah, I'm going to try. This is the first time that I've done something like this. Okay, I'm clicking on share screen. And then I click on my PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay.
And then you click share.
Okay. Okay, the PowerPoint seems to have come.
Yes.
Okay.
And now you go to the bottom. Do you remember that little square at the bottom, and you click that?
That I don't.
Okay.
I can see notes.
Keep moving to the right. Keep moving right. More.
Okay.
More. Next
okay.
One. No.
Next.
There,
this one.
That's the one. Yes.
Okay.
Click that. Click it. Click it.
Okay.
Yeah. There you are.
It's not.
Okay, well, you can use your arrows one way or backwards or forwards to go forward like this.
Okay, I hope it will work. Okay, by the way, I see that JP is here, JP Burke, because he's been very involved with the bibliography of South African Jewry during the period after I left. However, I'm mainly focusing on the earlier period to explain how it all came about and what I was focusing on. In the 1990s, when computers had only recently been introduced into the libraries of the University of Cape Town, the powers that be were slow to supply the Jewish Studies Library at the Kaplan Center with the necessary equipment and skills, probably because it was the smallest departmental library. As a result, for a period of approximately 6 months, I had little work to occupy myself. I had developed a special interest in South African literature in Yiddish and had already begun researching and listing both South African Yiddish and Hebrew publications. At the time, I was also aware that no comprehensive bibliography of South African Jewry had ever been compiled. The librarian at the Library of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies in Johannesburg, I think her name was Fanny Steyn, at the time had listed the collection of the library. At that time, the Library of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, that doesn't exist anymore, was the largest Jewish library in South Africa. This was the most comprehensive bibliography of South African Jewry that existed at that time. However, it only listed books and not articles. By the way, it had many items which one cannot find today, but I listed them nonetheless. My motivation was also to index the contents of the Journal of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, Jewish Affairs, that was initiated in July 1946 under the editorship of political journalist Henry Katsu. It was published monthly until 1988, when it became bi-monthly, then quarterly, and now only appears 3 times a year in digital format only. Although never a peer-reviewed journal, its editors were of a high standard, and it elicited articles from the experts in all fields of South African Jewry. It was a mine of information and by far the most comprehensive resource for information on South African Jewry. It was the first port of call for all researchers at that time, and its entries constituted half of the 1997 bibliography of South African Jewry. They are, by the way, also listed on an international database called the Index to Jewish Periodicals, but that's not open to the general public. I was supported in this project by Professor Milton Shane, director of the Kaplan Center at the time, as well as by Margaret Richards, principal librarian in the African Studies Division, of which the Jewish Studies Library was a part at that time. Professor Shane determined at the outset that the bibliography would be confined to the borders of South Africa and would not include its neighbors, Zambia and Zimbabwe, the former Northern and Southern Rhodesia, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, although our histories are closely connected. Okay, you can actually see there, my first task was to conceive of a structure for the bibliography, which for me meant analyzing the structure of the South African Jewish community. I came up with 7 broad subdivisions: guides to research, background, history, internal organization, statistics and social attitudes, relations with Israel, and contribution to South Africa. My initial dilemma was whether to include literature, fiction, poetry, essays, humor, in South African Jewry's various languages: English, Afrikaans, Yiddish, and Hebrew. In the case of Jewish languages, it was clear that the languages lent Jewish content to the literature. However, literature in English by South African Jewish authors raised questions such as, what is Jewish bibliography? Or who is a Jew? In the end, the solution for me was to be inclusive. I do not regret this decision, although it becomes unwieldy, especially as the bibliography grows exponentially with time. Since 1997, the explosion of the internet with its websites, exhibitions, and blogs, the digitization of periodicals, and open access to theses and dissertations has added a huge dimension to the scope of bibliography, whereas the bibliography of South African Jewry, published in 1997, included print items only. It's hard to believe. The 2023 edition includes a variety of digital contents. However, the bibliography has not only been updated, it has also been backdated, adding categories that were deliberately omitted in the 1997 edition, as well as items that were overlooked. The broad subdivisions, however, remain the same, with some changes reflecting the times. Okay, and there you have it. The Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies and Research, now under the directorship of Associate Professor Adam Mendelsohn, has conducted various new research projects in the field. For the latest survey of the South African Jewish community, C.D. Graham, The Jews of South Africa in 2019, Identity, Community, Society, Demography, which was published by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London, together with the Isaac and Jesse Center for Jewish Studies, in 2020. In the field of history, no surprises there. An important new communal history was published by Professors Mendelsohn and Shane. It's entitled The Jews in South Africa, an Illustrated History, and was published in 2008, and it went into a second edition in 2014. Also very important is the now 6-volume series, Jews in the Country Communities, by a research team led by Adrian Collenberg in Johannesburg. This covers all the small towns where Jews lived when they first came to South Africa, and it is encyclopedic in its coverage. I believe they are working, I think she wrote to you, Geraldine, that they're working on a 7th volume, and that will be the final volume.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, and there we get to politics. The first edition of the bibliography was published in 1997, only 3 years after South Africa's transition to democracy in 1994. Politics was always one of the largest sections in the bibliography, and this section continues to grow with endless postmortems of the apartheid years in monographs, articles, theses, and dissertations. The first edition ended concurrently with the publication of Cutting Through the Mountain, which you see there, interviews with South African Jewish activists, edited by Emmanuel Suttner in 1997. These interviews have been individually indexed in the later edition, by the way, which hasn't been published as yet. For the most important overview of the relationship between Jews and apartheid, see Professor Gideon Shimoni of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, Community and Conscience, The Jews in Apartheid South Africa. It was published in 2003. An interesting addition to the literature is that of, I call them second generation political activists. In fact, they weren't necessarily political activists, but the children of political activists, such as the recently published My 30-Minute Bar Mitzvah by Dennis Herson. Dennis is the son of Baruch Herson, a political activist, a member of the ARM, Armed Resistance Movement, who spent 12 years in jail. His son Dennis was just 12 years old at the time of his arrest, and he and his mother were allowed to see his father for just 30 minutes after his arrest in a police car, which for Dennis constituted his coming of age or his bar mitzvah. Another development that has spawned a large literary output is the establishment of the Holocaust and Genocide Centers in Cape Town in 1999, Johannesburg and Durban, 2008. With the parallels that exist between the Holocaust and apartheid, as well as comparisons to the Rwandan genocide in Central Africa, this is potentially one of the fastest growing sections in the literature. Notable in this area is Tully Nates, director of the Holocaust and Genocide Center in Johannesburg, Professor Shirley Gilbert at the University of London, and Dr. Ronnie Michael Ariely, a cultural historian, acting director of the Raab Center for Holocaust Studies at Ben-Gurion University, whose book, Remembering the Holocaust in a Racial State, Holocaust Memory in South Africa, from Apartheid to Democracy, 1948 to 1994, was published in 2022. Okay, with a growing interest in genealogy, roots, and heritage tourism, whether for personal interest or for the purposes of acquiring a European passport, the section on Eastern Europe, predominantly Lithuania, has increased fourfold. This section is divided between general overview articles and articles about individual towns that have witnessed the largest growth. There you see recollections of Trishik or Triskai in in Lithuania by Ita Hirsch. Sorry. At the same time, with the diminution of the South African Jewish community from just under 118,200 in 1970 to only 52,300 in 2019, the number of articles and books in the section on immigration and immigration have increased threefold. And there you see, it's been out for a while, Worlds Apart, which is about South African immigration to Australia, and a book on South African Jews in London. I think that they wanted to publish a book on South African Jews in Canada and other places, but I'm not quite sure what's happened about that, if there are any plans for the future. Publications on anti-Semitism have not grown at quite the same pace as before, and the increase is largely represented by the publications of former director of the Centre, Professor Milton Shane. During this period, Professor Shane published a second volume to his Roots of Anti-Semitism in South Africa. He published A Perfect Storm, that's Anti-Semitism 1930 to 1948, and that was in 2015. And right now, I was at the launch not long ago of his new and final volume in the trilogy, Fascists, Fabricators, and Fanaticists, Anti-Semitism in South Africa from 1948 to the present time. Okay, then we get to internal organization. And this section includes religious life, communal organization, and education. And there, unsurprisingly, to me at any rate, the category of religious life has seen the largest growth. This results from the increase in religiosity in the Johannesburg Jewish community in particular, that began in the 1970s with the arrival of Chabad rabbis into South Africa. These developments have most recently been documented in a PhD at the University of Cape Town on the history of Johannesburg Orthodoxy by David Fechler. And I'm not sure if it is already open access online. I myself have read it from beginning to end and found it absolutely fascinating. And at the same time, the first, you can see the picture there, the first comprehensive history of progressive Judaism in South Africa by Erwin Manoyim. And this is, he called it Mavericks Inside the Tent, the Progressive Jewish Movement in South Africa and its impact on the wider community, was published by UCT Press in 2019. I think it was initiated by the Kaplan Center. Again, I found that excellent and actually just a very good read, never mind the academic side of it. The field of education has been enriched by a new phenomenon, which seems to have started in 2019. These are postgraduate degrees from Middlesex University in conjunction with the London School of Jewish Studies, or maybe I should put it the other way around, London Jewish Studies in conjunction with Middlesex, by local South African rabbis, communal leaders, and others. And these include many dissertations on religious-related topics, which are, again, a very important contribution. I haven't got a picture to illustrate my next section, which is the section of statistics and social attitudes. I clearly didn't find a book with a suitable cover, but we have here the introduction of two new categories, that of gender and also foodways and cookbooks. When I wanted to include cookbooks in 1997, Professor Shane said, definitely not. The new category of gender that replaces the former category of women arose from the tremendous growth in issues of LGBTQIA, in the broader society, to which the South African Jewish community is not immune. As a result, the small section on women in the 1997 edition of the bibliography has been transformed into a new and larger section on gender. Another source of growth in this area is the Shalvi Hyman International Archive of Jewish Women, that to date includes some 15, it might be more, and growing. I know that I'm sitting on 3 that I haven't yet sent in, individual entries on South African Jewish women, as well as an overview of the history of South African Jewish women by Sally Frankenthal. That's all on the International Archive, and you can access it online. And at the moment, we eagerly await a history of the Union of Jewish Women, an organization first established in 1931 that combines social welfare with political activism and is still very active. And this book is to be launched, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's on the 7th of August, which means right now. Now, while food has always been an important indicator of South African Jewry cultural identity, cookbooks, as I said, they weren't conspicuous by their absence in the 1997 edition. The close to 100 and growing cookbooks that I have listed thus far provide invaluable insights into women's lives, as well as into South African Jewry's communal organizations. The only problem is the quantity, the number of cookbooks growing, and sometimes the ephemeral nature of the books. And as far as I'm concerned, some form of selection criteria will have to be devised, otherwise they're going to take over the bibliography. On the other hand, numbers in the categories of demography and identity have remained fairly static. On the other hand, the category of ethnic and language groups has increased threefold, mainly as a result of continuing research on the Jewish origins of the Lemba tribe. In the section on relations with Israel, the troubled relationship between the ANC government and the State of Israel, a result of the perceived collaboration of the State of Israel and the apartheid government, has led to an almost threefold increase in publications. Here, I found the best book, others might disagree with me, is by Sasha Polakov-Suransky, Israel's Secret Relationship with Apartheid South Africa, that was published in 2010. I've already spoken about politics, because politics falls into the section, always the largest section, which I call Contribution to South Africa. Politics, definitely the fastest growing area. In other categories, commerce has doubled, but here the accents is on self-published individual and family histories. The section on science and medicine has increased threefold, strangely enough, with the growth of a new phenomenon, and I believe it's not only in South Africa, it seems to be worldwide, of books describing the personal experience of living with a variety of medical conditions, such as dementia, Parkinson's disease, and many other conditions. As far as, the section on art, the section on art was strangely one of the largest sections by far in the 1997 edition, but it has remained relatively static, increasing by just under half, with the main focus still remaining on the artist Irma Stern. The book that I felt was the biggest contribution, and I'd actually used it when I had to write up Irma Stern. Today it's a monograph. I read the PhD at the time. It's published in the United States, and it's by somebody called Lenitra Berger, and it's Irma Stern and the Racial Paradox of South African Modern Art, and then subtitle Audacities of Color. What is so interesting about this particular monograph is that Lanitra Berger, who spent a long time researching her topic at the Irma Stern Museum, is herself an African American, which means, and as you know, Irma Stern's subjects were chiefly Black. So she somehow believed she brings a new angle onto the whole topic of Irma Stern, who you probably know was certainly not a political activist. She was just a regular South African with South African attitudes. As far as theatre is concerned, not so much ordinary theatre, but Yiddish theatre includes the little book that I did on Yiddish theatre. And this area has now increased tremendously, mainly because I have retrospectively indexed the Dorum Africa, the South African periodical. That was something else which was not wanted in the 1997 edition. I was told that I could list Yiddish books, but I couldn't index the Dorum Africa. And that has been, by the way, a very interesting exercise, not only for Yiddish theatre. In the category of literary criticism, the works of Nobel Prize winner Nadine Gordimer continue to generate the most interest. In the field of Afrikaans literature, the great interest was generated by a new biography of Sarah Goldblatt, Searching for Sarah, the woman who loved Langenhofen. It was published in 2021 by her niece, Dominique Malherbe, whom I had met because I had also written about Sarah myself, Sarah Goldblatt. I myself found her a very intriguing personality. Goldblatt was the secretary of the pioneer of the Afrikaans language, Cornelius Johannes Langenhofen, and became his literary executrix on his death, unheard of for a Jewish woman. It was she who gave the government permission to use his poem as the national anthem of South Africa. In addition, her father, who deserted his family for the United States in 1914, was one of the greatest Yiddishists and Yiddish journalists in South Africa. It was he who in 1902 convinced the Governor General, well, it was he and Morris Alexander, convinced the Governor General of the Cape Colony that Yiddish must be considered as a European language for the purposes of immigration. It was always rumored that Goldblatt had an affair with Langenhofen, and her niece confirms the rumor. She had already mentioned that to me some years ago, and even suggests that there was a love child, which of course did wonders for book sales. Okay, now we're getting towards the end. Yiddish literature is affected by the natural attrition of native Yiddish speakers in the Jewish community in South Africa as elsewhere. For this reason, the number of Yiddish books has hardly changed. There was only one 2-volume monograph that fell into the post-1997 time period, and that's David Wolpe, Ich und mein Welt, I and my world. It actually is, I have read it, and it's pretty hard going because his Yiddish is of a very, very high standard. And David Wolpe is the Itzik Manga prize-winning poet. An important new addition in the field in English is a new monograph on the leading South African Yiddish poet, David Fram, by Hazel Frankel, entitled Holocaust and Home, the Poetry of David Fram from Lithuania to South Africa, and it was published in 2021. as I said, I'm not going to touch too much on digital publications. If I were going to do that, I would involve J.P. Burke, who I would imagine is more versed in searching the internet than I am. Not that I don't do it. I however did some counting, and I found in terms of thesis and dissertations submitted to universities in South Africa and abroad, I wanted to compare them, and it yielded some interesting findings. In common with that of published works, the topic of Holocaust leads the way, very closely followed by Jewish education, and then South African Zionism, South Africa-Israel relations, and of course, politics. By far, the majority of the research is still generated in South Africa by the Kaplan Center and by the University of the Witwatersrand. Overseas theses and dissertations on Jewish South African related topics are currently most numerous in the United States, followed very closely by the UK, but that's only because of those mini dissertations, which are only 15,000 words. And with the popularity of the mini dissertations offered in the UK by the London School of Jewish Studies in conjunction with Middlesex University. Lagging behind in producing research dissertations and theses is Israel, followed by Australia and Canada. European theses and dissertations include, I found the University of Leiden in Belgium, had two, the University of Notre Dame in France, I found there was one, and the Vilnius Academy of Arts in Lithuania also one, and that I did know about because I met the author, Karina, forget what her surname is, and then there was one from the University of Iceland. As I said, the online searching, I would imagine, is done more by JP. JP's selection of items differs slightly to mine. He looks further into Africa, whereas I confine myself to South Africa, as that is what we defined at the beginning with Professor Shane. What does the future hold? Now, this is a fraught question, as many of the main contributors to the literature have retired, and it is not clear who will take their place. What with the troubled political situation in South Africa, immigration continues to increase and the community continues to shrink. There's definitely a growing phenomenon that more and more commentary on South African Jewry is being written by former South Africans living overseas and holding positions or studying at overseas universities, whether in London or in Israel. In the local universities, students tend to focus on economics and business rather than on the humanities or modern languages. The history of the Holocaust is the only course in Jewish studies that is still offered, even though it wasn't offered this year, and I'm not sure if it was offered last year either. So much of the growth in this bibliography is in areas that are anecdotal on the whole, rather than research related. That because they're anecdotal, they do not shed light on the community as such. Sorry, most of the books are anecdotal, or they are in areas that don't shed light on our community, such as books about the Lemba tribe. I mean, it's very interesting, but it doesn't tell us anything about our Jewish community. Nonetheless, there is hope because there still remain areas that are under-researched. And I'm going to mention here Yiddish in particular, not only because it is my own area of research and I'm quite passionate about it, and I have just started. Well, I've got one book that is in the process of publication, and another topic that I've just started and that I'm very excited about in the field of Yiddish. And on the other hand, there are areas that can be approached in different ways, as well as comparative work. And that's where I see a lot of the future in comparative work with South Africa's rich array of cultural and ethnic groups that could render very interesting results. And I must mention that I wrote this. Paper, it's actually a few months ago. And this was how I ended it as far as comparative works with South Africa's other ethnic groups. And lo and behold, the Kaplan Center has just had a conference called the Litvak Diaspora, which I participated in. And I thought it was a 3-day conference, and I thought it was really excellent, with a wide array of subjects about Litvaks all over the world. But what they also did, which I didn't know, was they brought in, there were 2 comparative talks. They brought in somebody, they flew him from Joburg, a Jewish chap, I think his surname was Goldberg, and he's been working with Somalis and Ethiopians, and in a business context. And that was fascinating. And then there was also a presentation by a Congolese lady, a PhD student involved in postdoctoral work. And she spoke to us about what it means to be a Congolese refugee, which was also absolutely fascinating. That's about all that I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Veronica. That's really fascinating and very interesting. And I'm delighted to see that there are still, we've been going nearly 3 hours.
I know.
And there are still many people in this room. So it just shows you how interesting and interested we are. So Veronica, if you can go to where it's at the top where it says you're sharing your screen, to press the red thing that says stop share. And there's just time if somebody wants to make any comments or to talk. Gail, I know you want to say something, so please unmute. And
yeah, I'd like to say that was really, really fascinating. And, it would be lovely to be able to discuss these things in far more depth. What I have noticed though, Veronica, in your bibliography, something is really missing in all these different, aspects of bibliography, and that is Southern African Jews in the world today, and the research on them. I don't mean like specifically say Jews of Canada, Jews of Israel, etc. But there's so much when you think about it sociologically that happened to this generation of people who left South Africa just during apartheid, after apartheid, or whatever, just one generation or 2 having been in South Africa, and to actually research their attitudes, their achievements, all kinds of things about us, which I find very fascinating. And maybe that's what drew me into hearing people's stories. But it's just an idea that I came up with like listening to you. Thank you.
Thank
Gail,
you.
can I respond? Because there is a lot written, particularly about South Africans in Israel in the later period.
But from what point of view?
Articles, dissertations, etc., etc.
I understand that. I'm kind of thinking about it more from, as so many other subjects were researched, from actually researching it. What happened to Jews, say, in Israel, or in terms of attitude, in terms of their, like now in Israel with all these terrible issues and democracy and our attitude to apartheid, etc. To be able to really define the Jews from South Africa in the world, because there's such strong connections between them. And there must be some way of trying to, I'm not a research expert, but trying to kind of, not only dissertations about what people have achieved, but what's really happened to this whole, amazing, heaven knows, a few million, 100,000, hundreds of thousands of people. Just that was my question to myself.
Can I just say something? What I would imagine is that, of course, Veronica is just listing what's written.
That's right.
She's not telling people what to write, So
no. I'm just thinking that's what
she will collect it,
Sure.
And my other just comment is that South Africa could never have contained the richness of the talent that came out of South Africa, came out of this little Litvak group, just looking at a medical class of, where 50% were Jews, and they are now professors all over the country, all over the world. South Africa did not have enough institutions to contain all that. Laura.
Hi, it's not, I just wondered, because you mentioned about not including Zambia and Zimbabwe. So I just wondered if there was anything that was ever going to, or if you knew of anything that was going to be done on it, or if there is anything that has been done on it, a bibliography?
Well, as I said, JP, it would be the one to ask, because in his listing, he does include Zambia, Zimbabwe, etc. But
Okay.
as I said, I haven't included it. I just felt that what I was doing was already more than about as much as I could handle. And I wanted to be inclusive, and I didn't feel, this was Milton Shane's view, we didn't feel that we could be inclusive on those countries. So therefore, just focus on the borders of South Africa.
So where would I find? Where would I find?
You could speak to, email JP, but, I don't know to what extent he started from the very beginning.
Has he got something online?
Well, his bibliographies are online. They were published in Jewish Affairs. So you can look in Jewish Affairs. Look, I can't tell you about the quantity.
No,
as
all
I
right.
said,
Okay.
Okay,
But
well,
it's
something.
something.
So JP, can you unmount, we're not soldiers or we're not on camels, but unmute, and maybe you could tell us something.
Yeah, so can you hear me? The bibliographies that Veronica's referring to is what I wrote for the South Africa, the Jewish Affairs Journal of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, which is online. They got a website. Was it jewishaffairs.com or something like that?
Okay.
Or .org? I get mixed up, but there is that website. It's David Sachs is the editor, and then maybe someone can put a link in the group there. But it's not organized necessarily according to theme. It's basically the previous year's bibliography of Southern African jury related material for the previous year. Like I would be putting out this year for 2022 kind of thing. But it's I haven't been doing it every year. So what I could do is, if you want, I could send you an amalgamated list, and then you can just search it.
I'd appreciate that.
Are you
Okay, but
offering to do the bibliography of Zimbabwe?
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if it would be a big
contribute
task. Happy to contribute, but
you know what we can do is we can make a Google Doc, and then whoever can contribute, whoever's interested in contributing to it, we can just make it a shared document, something like that. So maybe that's how to start it with you, Laura. Maybe I can start something.
Laura is
but also, what's his name?
Of Rabbi Converser.
Yes, I know. Yes, that's right.
Well, I'm his daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
And I was a librarian in my last life. I actually did a bit of work with Veronica, but a long time ago.
Exactly. So you're ideally placed for this.
No, not sure about that.
To contribute.
The other gentleman, Bloom, was his name? He did Zimbabwe website, Bloom. So maybe I can also contact
Dave.
you.
Oh, Dave. I know Dave Bloom.
So we can get him involved as well. I'm sure he could help to contribute. But that's, yes, so, okay, all right, we'll be in touch.
Okay, I think the three
Right.
of you be in touch and do what
Do
you
I
want
need
do.
to, should I give you my email address?
Okay.
I'll put you all together.
In the chat, yeah, in the emails.
I'll send an email to the three of you with all your addresses. And
All right, thank
and I
you.
think if this comes out of this session, that we've now created a platform for Zimbabwe and Zambian bibliography, you know, so good.
Okay, I think that would include, do you include Malawi as well or not?
You
Well,
decide.
might as well do it with Rebbe Silberhoft and just make a whole AJC, what's it, AJC thing or something.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Maybe.
Brilliant. So, you know, I love it when something happens that you then develop something else that grows organically. So I'm going to say that the formal part of this event is over. But if anybody wants to stay and chat or talk to each other, I won't close the room immediately. But it's been wonderful to have these presentations, and you know, hopefully you had enough time. And so thank you very much. If anybody wants to talk, you can just talk.
And I just say something.
Yeah.
There's that wonderful website on Zimbabwean Jury, which Dave Plum is involved with. And Laura, we've actually got Rabbi Converser listed on the soldiers because he was a chaplain in the war.
I know that, but I wanted to actually, I was trying to find out some information about that because I've got nothing. All I know was that he was, but I've got no record of it anywhere. Have you got that?
We've put up a little profile on him and have a look. It will be referenced because every profile that's put up has to have a reference, whether it's from books or theses. In fact, there was an excellent thesis done by an Afrikaans fellow about the ministers who served in the Second World War, and there was a beautiful section on the Jewish contributors who were involved. In fact, this is what your father-in-law is actually mentioned in terms of that.
So we will be on that website.
Yeah, and if you just put in the name Converser, you'll find a thing. But to get the English, click on the British flag.
Okay, thank you.
Just Veronica, one of the books you mentioned was Gideon Shimoni, The Community and Conscience. And interestingly enough, the picture on the front of the book is of a woman, Pearl Wolfson or Perla Poloni, the mother of photographer Giselle Wolfson. And Wits University actually had an exhibition on Giselle last year at the Wits Museum, and it was to commemorate her. She was a photographer, started off with Star and was involved in taking photographs of numerous of the political figures. There was an exhibition of the Women of Apartheid, which was at the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, which Giselle attended. She subsequently died, and fantastic exhibition. And it would be lovely if she was recognized, or if these exhibitions get recognized or listed on your medium to commemorate these Jewish people who contributed to South Africa. Obviously, there's nothing in the literature written about Giselle, besides a few articles that have been published, but Wits actually had an exhibition dedicated to her, and she had very strong Jewish roots.
I should mention that I can't remember because I've heard Giddy speaking here and there, but probably was on Zoom. But he discussed how carefully he chose the cover of his book. I mean, he really put a lot of thought into that.
Yeah.
You know, especially having her and having, you know, her maid.
Yeah, that was Giselle's, actually, that was Giselle's caregiver. Yeah.
Okay. You know, a lot of thought that didn't happen by happenstance.
No,
That
I'm
was
sure
very
not.
carefully thought out.
But what was interesting is I sent that because they're a relative of mine from Rustenburg. We grew up in Rustenburg actually, and I sent it on to the children, and they weren't actually aware of the publication. But their mother on the front page, which was interesting.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's something.
Yeah, because the one daughter's in Atlanta, 2 children are in Cape Town, and Giselle passed away 11 years ago. Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, and Geraldine and everyone. It's been a wonderful afternoon, and many thanks to you for including me, and good luck with the project. And I might add in maybe looking at communities of adding in from the old Transvaal place like Rustenburg, where we had a community of 60 families who were very active. A lot of the research has been done by Beta Futsot, Ilona Steinfeld in Johannesburg at the moment, who's involved with the books. So I think there often is a crossover of information that we can use. And the Jewish genealogy, Geraldine, I see you're under the Kahila links. There's the whole thing on the Kimberley community.
Yeah, so that's how I got involved in this to create a Kimberley site. But you know, look at the whole website, and you'll see like Brantford. Some Faiza Shaskolsky has written a book on Brantford, and that's on there. So, you know, this is a place to find everything in one place. And the country communities, you know, have said to us, here is the information, by all means use the information. We're not competing. We've asked them many times to actually present on these presentations, and they say, oh no, we're too busy writing, you know, volume 7. Maybe when we finish, we'll do that. But we highly respect and admire the enormous work that they've done. And we're grateful that they said we could use it as information for the websites. But it needs somebody like you to just take it from there, write it out under these headings, and Brainy will post it. It's very easy. We've got the template. You've got the stories, you know, put them together. So it's been lovely to have you along, and I hope you'll join us again. Okay, everybody. Josh Khan, nice to see you. You've been very quiet. How are you doing with thinking about these series websites? You just need to unmute and you can tell us about it.
We are working on it. The curator of the museum, we're having discussions, and we're going to get on with it for sure.
Yeah, I think that we can link to a lot of the stuff that's already on the museum. You know what I mean? We can do it in partnership with the museum. We don't have to take it away. Do you know what I mean? We can see how we can use what's on the museum for some of the sections rather than.
When I say the museum, I mean the Ceres Museum.
The Ceres Museum, yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So
there's a lot of material there which we can use and will use. Yes.
Yeah. Great. So don't leave it too long.
No, not at all. It's just,
you know, we have to be aware that, you know, we're getting on. We can't rely on the fact that we're going
to. Yeah, no.
Okay. And Rochelle, lovely to see you. So, and so Charlotte came on as well. So, you know, Petersburg could have has got a kind of website that Eli Rabinovich started, Kahila Links one. So that could be built on. You have to unmute if you want to talk to us.
Okay. I say there's a great deal, and I've often sort of started and stopped little things. And of course, I've read Charlotte, and I wrote a novel which tried to tell, which fictionalized, but it was based on my grandparents' arrival from Latvia, not from Lithuania. Now, so when you say Litvak, does that include Latvia?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because they're not the same, and they're not the same people.
No, they were much more snootier, the Latvians. They thought they were.
They were snootier. My father's family is Latvian, and my mother's family were Lithuanian, and I remember these conversations in the house. And it's not totally, well, I don't know if it's a reason to be snooty, but they were very influenced by the German culture.
Yeah, they were possibly more educated, more cultured, with a wider outlook.
With a wider, but the Lithuanians were more Yiddishkeit. That's what my But they're not the same, and I don't know if they would like to be. To me, it makes no difference. But I don't know if they would like to be under the same label as the Litvak, because they never. That was not the way they spoke.
Never they are.
My father was born in South Africa, as was my mother, but their backgrounds were different, and I often wonder, Litvaks, but they didn't think they were Litvaks. They didn't.
Well, they didn't think they were. Yeah.
But whether they were right or wrong, I have no idea. But I know what they thought of themselves. They spoke German. His parents spoke German with each other, rather than rather than Yiddish, or they also knew Russian and Latvian, of course.
I think the education was far more widespread. They learned, whereas they didn't just go to yeshiva and a Talmud Torah, they went to gymnasium, And
the girls also went to school, and and they say in the Wikipedia, even girls from poor families went to school, which is something to say for that part. And it's interesting. And Petersburg, there were a lot of people from Latvia because they came to the farms. They didn't just come to the town. Whereas Johannesburg, I think there were much less. My mother's family comes from Johannesburg.
So, Rochelle, is your story, your book, in digital form?
My story, if it's in this, yes, it is. It is in digital form. It is.
In digital form. So why don't we put it on the website, under memoirs, or under stories?
Well, it's not memoirs because it's fiction.
It's kind of memoir, yeah.
I based it on what I heard, but I didn't know those people. I met my grandmother. She died when I was 3. But my grandfather I never saw, and I wrote their story from hearsay and from research and from and some of it I made up,
And has Veronica got your book? Is it on her database?
No, I don't think so.
Well, you should send me I'll send you a citation. I'd love it. I'd love a copy.
I can send it to you in email. Have I got your? Well, I have your email.
It should be on the website.
Okay, website. Will you get me her email, Geraldine?
I will. Yeah.
And I will say I'll send you. I'm happy to have the book read, and I think my daughter took it to the Jewish Museum in Cape Town, but I'm not sure that when she went back last year, she said she couldn't find it. So
what is it called? Somebody's borrowed it and kept it.
It's called My Dear Papa, Letters from...
I've got it. I've read it. It's a wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, I love it because it's, it's like writing a book. I really, I've sort of brought them back to life, but I didn't know them. There's a lot of guesswork. My brother said to me, are you writing about your grandmother or are you writing about yourself? Or what? That's what he said to me when he read it. And So, you know, it was a lot of, it's fiction, historical fiction, I call it. It's based, to the best of my knowledge, on fact, but it's not a memoir. It's not history. It's not.
Well, we can put it on the stories page then.
Well, it's a book. It's a long story. I mean, it's a short book, but it's not a short story. But I would be delighted, you know, more of the people that read it, I'm delighted. And, and it does give the Hirschman family in Petersburg, my grandfather's family, was enormous. My cousins in Petersburg, I mean, half of the Jewish community in Petersburg were my cousins.
Wonderful.
And we were 90 families there. I'm exaggerating, perhaps not half, but a huge number of people in the town were originally from my grandfather's family.
Yeah.
Yeah. So perhaps I will write something about Petersburg. I know Charlotte has done a lot of work on Petersburg.
Well, if you go to the website, the whole website, and look at Petersburg, see what you can add. You can add your family stories. You know what I mean? There is something there that you can add to.
Okay, I'll do that.
Brilliant. Okay, everybody. Well,
can I just ask one question? Yeah. I did a book about my ancestors, which actually was put in the JPI. She gave it to you years ago, and I then used the photographs in the Jewish Digital Project. I've got it in a digital form if you want to put it on the website. It just traces the families, where they came from and what actually happened to them in South Africa, because like most Jewry, there's hardly anyone left.
Okay, well, send me a link to it and we'll see.
I'll send you a link to it, or just the digital form, because in fact, part of how I got involved with soldiers was I helped with the Jewish Digital Project at the Jewish Museum, helping them with the archiving and accessing better references. So there's a whole project on that, but you'll have it at the Kaplan Museum. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Go and have a cup of tea or supper or breakfast or lunch or whatever time it is. Thanks for coming and enjoy yourself, and let's meet again soon.
Thanks.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.